Okay, and we are live. This is John from the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video we're going to be discussing whether a roleplay group benefits from a well-defined leader. I have a number of distinguished guests with us. We have GM Barker, if you'd care to introduce yourself and say a bit about yourself, and possibly plug your channel if you so wish.
Oh, yes. My name is Barker. My channel is Be a Better Game Master, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And next we have Chepe, or Fawn Trodden, if you'd care to introduce yourself and say a bit about yourself and your YouTube channel if you wish.
Hello, I am Chepe Lepepe, and my channel is Fawn Trodden, where I talk about random theory things, make video responses, and do homebrew 5e content, as well as talk about random indie games that nobody ever hears about. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. And next in the line, going along my film strip at the bottom, we've got Mike with us. If you want to say a bit about yourself and your gaming history, Mike.
I'm Mike. I've been playing for a few years, starting in uni, getting into it more as a GM. History of storytelling and game design kind of works well with it. Mike doesn't do YouTube channels, but if he did, they'd probably suck. Yeah.
Okay, and last but not least, we've got John Swoop McCoy, or Skank and Spits, if you care to say a bit about yourself and your RP history, and plug your channel if you so wish.
Sure, yeah. Skank and Spits, as you can see at the bottom there. That's a reference to sort of ska music in my band, not a reference towards promiscuity or anything like that. But yeah, I play a lot of World of Darkness, a lot of horror games probably is my, I guess, introduction, starting point into the hobby. I've GM'd, DM'd, whatever you want to call it, more than I've played. And yeah, that's about it. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for all agreeing to participate in the Hangout. And I'm just going to throw out a few questions related to the subject. I'll try and address them to individual people, but as I was saying before we went on air, we're never going to entirely eliminate people talking over each other due to lag, different bandwidths, etc. So if you do have anything you want to jump in on, just wait for a natural pause and then feel free to jump in, guys. So in terms of the basic question, do roleplay groups benefit from a well-defined leader? I think one of the sort of important aspects that one of you kicked up on the Facebook group was how are we defining a leader in this context, and whether we're talking about an OOC leader or an IC leader. Now, initially when I posed the question, I was thinking more on a sort of out-of-character level, you know, someone to sort of G the game along a bit when people had got bogged down in terms of sort of scenery chewing, which is great fun, but can lead to a game being a bit sort of stagnant until that point when you get to the end of a session and you think, oh well, I really enjoyed that session, but when you look at what you've actually done, you've just spent the entire like 3 hours or whatever sat in a tavern chatting to the locals, and you're no nearer to, which can be fun, don't get me wrong, but you're no nearer to like reaching the end goal of your campaign. So I don't know what you guys think about that, whether it even matters or whether you guys are happy to just sort of chew over things in a session. Barker, what would be your viewpoint on that sort of thing?
I think in a lot of ways you find the answer in the same place. When I think out-of-character leader, I think, you know, someone who's charismatic, who's progressive in the game, who has a tendency to say, come on guys, let's go, let's do this, make decisions, and the other players around the table kind of, you know, usually magnetically follow that person. When I think in-character leader, I think, okay, these are all in the storyline where the leadership is embedded, like maybe they're all in a military squad and this person's the captain, you know, and everyone else is like corporal, you know, you have your ranks, but, you know, this person's in charge. But I think even in that case, you have to think about out of character, who are you going to give the captain to? Because if you give captain to the person at the table who says I am Groot the whole time, who backs into the corner, just, you know, likes to play the, whether maybe they're shy or maybe they just like to role play in a certain way that's not very leadership oriented, you kind of have to consider that into your decision as to, okay, who gets the rank. So I think you kind of have to think out of character in all or at least most cases. Anyway.
No, I mean, I'd entirely agree with that. I think if you've not got someone who is capable of taking that leadership role, or perhaps doesn't feel comfortable with it, then having their character take on such a role isn't possibly going to work as well as someone who is prepared to, on an out of character level, sort of step forward. I don't know if any of the rest of you guys want to jump in, and if you have a viewpoint on that. How do you see things as going based on this sort of OC-IC dynamic when it comes to the leader of a group in role-play games?
I mean, generally, I think the in-character, as Barker said, probably would develop either based on the premise of the campaign or organically through the natural charisma. I think the out-of-character one is something that would either gravitate more towards the DM or to someone in the group that may not be a charismatic character. And one of the things that's fun about role-playing is always playing characters that aren't like you. So you might have that person who is charismatic, who wants to play the Wallflower or the Quiet Wizard or something like that. And they might be good at getting the group organized and on track for sessions, or be, reminding everyone when they start going off track that, we've got an end goal we need to go to. At the same time, I think sometimes it is good for sort of building a person, sort of building yourself naturally when the quiet people do get the chance to take the leadership role. And from experience, I've seen quiet people, and me as the DM have shoved that leadership onto them, and they've taken to it very well, and they've come out of the sort of shyness aspect of themselves and started participating more into the group a lot more.
Has anybody here actually run? I used the military example earlier. Run a game where, or played in a game where there were ranks, like in character, basic, very firm leadership roles. And did you have any problems or benefits from that?
Well, I'm running a game right now where there aren't necessarily multiple ranks, but they are the Changeling the Lost campaign, where the player characters are the crew of a ship. And in the very first session, the captain is going off to do his own thing, or who has been captaining up to this point, and he leaves it on them to, you guys can decide who's going to be the new captain, because that's how generally captains are decided in the first place. Is they are elected. They don't take their power by force, unless I suppose they have enough money to do that. But so it ended up that it was funny because the guy that was very new to role playing, the first traditional RPG he's ever played, he's very new to it. He's a very shy person in general, and he's playing a character that's not necessarily. It didn't jump out to me like it would be, but he ended up being the captain. And, I expressed that I was kind of surprised out of character, and they were already checking with me, out of character, well, who's going to be the captain? And I was, just shrugging my shoulders, and, I would guide them if I needed to, but I kind of wanted them to define it. And so he ended up being the captain, his character, and like I said, it was kind of funny because he's, the kind of the stereotypical new guy, and he's really into it, but it's just a whole new world for him, and now he's the leader of this party, and 4 sessions later everyone's sort of raising an eyebrow, wondering if it was really an appropriate choice for a leader. But it sort of manifested in an interesting way. Because he's sort of reserved and he's new and a bit aloof, it translates in the game that his character is a little bit removed from the rest of them, as a leader probably would be. So it's working, but it's interesting, and I have to see where exactly things are going to go.
I suppose the nearest
time that any decision has to be made in the narrative, they always ask, well, what does the captain want to do? What does the captain? And the whole group throws it on him every time. So I'm like, fine, if you guys always want to do what he wants, then we'll see how long that'll last.
I think that's in-character leadership, at its best. Honestly, when in-character leadership works so well when everyone around the table is unanimous in their agreement that, yep, he's going to make the choice.
I think the nearest I've got to it is in a Rogue Trader game that I ran, and sort of Rogue Trader with the sort of Warhammer 40k background is based around the idea that you are one of the players is a rogue trader who basically has a writ of trade and the accompanying spaceship that allows them to travel around the Imperium, dealing with alien races and strange technologies that the average man wouldn't be authorized to deal with. So you sort of have to have one person who is in overall charge of the ship, but the other different character classes all have their own sort of individual little niches. Like there's the navigators, and without a navigator you can't pilot your ship through the warp and travel faster than light and get about. So everyone sort of fits in together, but it does have that sort of rank scheme sort of hard baked into the system, and that seemed to work okay. But the face-to-face group I ran that for, they sort of slipped very easily, because they're all used to role-playing with each other. They sort of slipped very easily into those roles where you've always got the person who's quite forward and quite willing to sort of take that leadership role, and maybe some other people who want to sit back a bit, and they ended up being the engineers, the psychics, etc., with the sort of the other ranks on board the ship rather than the face of the actual party. So has anyone else run a game with ranks involved in it, where it's sort of like actually built into it?
I don't know. Well, I have played one game that does have that built into it, and I also did a story scenario where that also happened, that I can think of off the top of my head. Right here on hand, which is what I'm trying to, the reason why I thought of it, because I'm trying to run a one-shot for it, is Made the RPG, which is light anime situational comedy, and Barker's already tired of it. But in the system, you have the GM as the master of the mansion, and his only, although you can have a character play it, so you can run a scenario where the character is the master of the mansion and everyone else is the maid or butler. But how it's done is that the master doesn't get much power other than just the ability to give orders, and the characters have to do it. But how they do it and what happens, and most of the narrative mechanics are involved by the maids. So it's kind of, it balances itself out by giving them absolute power in a one specific thing, and then giving checks and balances for everyone else to kind of cancel it out if they really need to. I played in a game where my character was the guy who hired two other characters. It was based in the 1920s, but it was a very loose, reimagined 1920s that involved ninjas and robots.
Yeah, that's pretty loose.
That's pretty loose, yeah. And it kind of backfired because I was just playing my character, but one of the other guys was the kind of individual who is almost an anarchist politically, and didn't like that form of order at all. And so they ended up bounding and gagging their employer after the job as soon as they took the money, and then found ways to kidnap me. And that's how we ended the session. So it can backfire if you're dealing with people who have authority issues, even in character.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about people having to have certain characteristics if they are going to role play a sort of in-character leadership role. And obviously it's been said that people who are more than capable of playing a leadership role can want to play a sort of a more drawn-back character, or a less sort of authoritarian character. In terms of the opposite, though, if you've maybe got someone who's not as comfortable with putting themselves out there and putting themselves forward for that sort of leadership role, but who maybe wants to give it a go, how would you guys go about sort of making that happen? Like, for instance, if you were running a game, and let's say just for convenience sake, it had a command structure of some type in it, where you have one player who's the commander of the squad, and one of the players comes up to you and says, I know I normally play a bit of a sort of background character in games, but I fancy giving it a go at being the commander, and the other players are fine with them giving that a go. How would you go about sort of bringing that player into that role, as it were? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mike.
I would definitely work with them to build up either their reputation, their actions, Ask them how they see themselves becoming that commander. Because in any type of military role, you've got different types of commanders. You've got the strategists who sort of sit on the sidelines and tell the people where to go and sort of see the bigger picture. Ender would probably be a good example of that. But you also have other ones that are sort of at the front, physically leading in charges, or their martial prowess is just great. Conan would probably be a better example of that. So see how they want to develop that command. Work with them to build that command and let them take over it naturally, because if it's something that they've talked to you about, they clearly want it to happen. It's something they'd be very excited to happen. So as long as you give them the bait, they'll take the reins and just roll with it.
Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts on ways to bring out a more sort of, I suppose, a more retiring player, but who wants to give it a shot at a leadership role?
I think you knocked out the most difficult challenge by having everyone around the table agree, okay, this person's going to be it. I think that is difficult because if you don't do that, the game goes nowhere. I mean, you spend a week, creating these intricate storylines, and they spend the 6 hours bickering among themselves about where they're going to buy their sausages. If you get past that, I think that immediately just give them choices, really simple choices like left or right. Okay, so and then kind of lead into more morally ambiguous choices, like, okay, in one of my games right now, I've given one of my characters, Garthor, leadership over 3 different hobgoblin tribes, and he is going to kind of realize pretty soon that hobgoblins don't work together unless there's a sole figure that's really keeping them together. And if he decides he doesn't want to do this, they're going to basically ravage the countryside. That said, they are set on, these hobgoblins their goal is to destroy this town that Garthor probably will not want to destroy. So he has to choose, okay, do I let them destroy this town, or do I say, nope, I'm not doing this anymore, and watch them basically tear up the countryside? Now that is kind of a further down the road type of decision, but any sort of basic choice, like simple and then slowly growing more and more complex, just put it right on the table for them and just look them in the eye and say, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a very good point that you've made, where eliminating any arguments amongst the players about that decision does potentially take away one of the sort of major stumbling blocks of that situation, because, as you rightly say, if the players don't agree about something, or even worse, get into a massive debate about something, that can just eat up a vast amount of session time, which could have been put to the far more enjoyable usage of, well, actually role-playing during a session. Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I'm sure we've all had sessions where even the littlest of decisions, not even like a big decision like who's going to leave the party, like you say, I know I've watched John's video about space vegetables a number of times, where he talks about effectively being made to make a sort of shopping list in a sci-fi game and sort of pick all the provisions for some massive space voyage, which I must have watched that video about half a dozen times, and it still makes me laugh, because I think it's something that probably will speak to a lot of role players. We've all been in games where something seemingly inconsequential has just, like a sponge, sucked up all the actual role-playing time. You get to the end of it and you're like, oh, well, we know we've got 6 cabbages now. Well, hopefully we can crack on with the actual adventure next session.
Have you ever played Oregon Trail and you spend 3 hours at the beginning stocking up, and then 8 minutes until you die, actually going on the trail until you die from dysentery? Like, wow, that 3 hours, you could have played and died like 19 times. I'm not sure about the math on that one.
So I can't. I do love Call of Cthulhu, but I can't bring myself to spend more than a certain amount of time genning up a character, because it's sort of part of the game that you're inevitably going to die at some point. It's just how long you die. And I know some people don't particularly like that. I have no problems with it personally, but I always think there's probably people who spend like hours and hours sort of creating a character, and then the first time they open a forbidden tome or something slimy like slithers out from the the nether regions of space and time, that they fail that sanity roll, and oh well, that's that character off to the asylum.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So gen up your next character.
And then every character they roll or create after that is going to be just have a little less put into it, because they know, well, they're going to die, and that's not what a DM wants anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was gonna say that's a really interesting thought, though. Would a Cthulhu type game really have a place for a party leader, for in character or out of character? Because you're gonna die anyway. Like if it's about a mystery unraveling or being led into your doom, essentially, then do you really need a leader if you're already being led?
I think a lot of it probably
I had in my Brigade Con Cthulhu game, we had sort of a leader, in the sense that it was a game set in Tibet, an expedition party in Tibet, and there was, of course, the guy who financed the expedition, as there should, unless you want it to be some faceless shadow organization, I guess. But I wanted to make it matter to the characters, at least one of them. So I made him the guy that hired everyone. So there was, I suppose, a certain amount of people turning to him in game, like, all right, are we gonna go? Are we ready or whatever? That he made those sort of decisions. But like you were saying about the other game, it's a system of checks and balances, where it's like, sure, he's paying the bills and he's got everyone here, but I mean, essentially they're the ones that do they're all the explorer types. He's just financing it. So, I guess he, in a sense, was the leader, but over gameplay, and of course, because in the horror games you lose control of power, and that's the thing that makes it scary, is the fear of the unknown and the loss of control. So I think in a Cthulhu game, regardless of how you set up, eventually there's going to be chaos and anarchy, and no one's going to be a leader. Or maybe there's a status shift, or something like. I don't watch The Walking Dead, but I assume that it's a series of status shifts. As people wax and wane, as people regain their sanity and lose it. There's different really cool leaders at different times.
That's a really cool thought that you said, Spank and Spitz, because what you just said was that it does have a place in horror, because you can actually use that status, that leadership, as a way of establishing comfort or regularity, and use that as a place of horror in order to break that, because if the players are depending on that structure, you can break that structure in order to kind of create a sense of instability.
I think a lot of that depends on the pacing of the game as well. Cause certainly in the sort of Cthulhu games I've played, it obviously starts off quite slow with the lead into the horror, and then once things actually start kicking along, that pacing really picks up, sort of building to that old crescendo of like, oh, there's the revelation of whatever is behind the plot, and that inevitably that's the point when the remaining characters discover the horrible truth about what's going on. So I wonder, is maybe a leader not quite so necessary if you've got a more fast-paced game? I certainly know in the horror games I've played, once it starts sort of licking along at that sort of really quick pace when you're building up to the final revelation, the final scene, whatever you want to call it, I really wouldn't think you perhaps need a leader there, because you're already sort of locked onto that path and you're sailing along it. Whereas at the start, when there's more sort of investigation, you're a bit freer to do what you want, go where you want. I think perhaps that's the point when maybe people can start wandering a bit and things can maybe get a little bit off track or a little bit slower, and someone to sort of spur things along a bit or point people in the right direction might be a bit more useful.
I feel also, like in that, what you just mentioned, that is this the case for you, John, where if you have a game that starts off kind of slow, has a real nice exposition, that it's more difficult to pick a party leader at the end of that, where if you just put them in media res, boom, there's gunfire, this is your captain or whatever, I find that might be easier. Is it, it's kind of, do you find it more difficult after a long exposition for the party to agree on a single person to follow?
I mean, certainly myself, I think that if you have a situation where, just to use a ridiculously stereotyped example, if you've got people sat around in a tavern who are about to go on a standard sort of fantasy adventure, and you just say, right, you're preparing to go to the Wizard's Tower or whatever, you've got your provisions. You're all sat around. You're just having like a brew before you're about to go out on this mission. What are you doing? Crack on with it. People will tend to sit around. They'll discuss things. It tends to sort of, it becomes one of those almost, I suppose, bloated scenes where it has no real impact on the rest of the game. And don't get me wrong, it can be fun, and let's face it, who doesn't enjoy playing a sort of ridiculously stereotypical tavern scene? I certainly do. But if it goes on for too long, and you, as I was saying at the start, and you get to like the end of your 3-4 hours, whatever gaming time, because obviously people have got like real life stuff they have to do, time is sort of like a precious commodity, then you go, oh well, we've had 3 hours of rollicking good fun in the tavern where we talked about what beers they'd got on tap, and someone made a pass at the barmaid, and there was a bit of a bar brawl, and that broke up. And you go, so next session, actually getting to the Wizard's Tower. I find that you can get sort of lost with things like who's going to be the party leader, since there's no real like immediate impetus to decide. The adventure isn't really going to occur normally in a sort of standard example until you leave that tavern and go to the site of the adventure. And obviously you can have it running in the background, and basically if you don't get there in time, the evil wizard's already raised his unliving hordes or whatever horrible thing he was going to do. Bad times for you. But by and large, it doesn't tend to, the adventure doesn't really kick in until you've actually sort of set your feet on that path. So I think without any sort of impetus or urgency, questions like, oh, are we going to have a party leader, they tend to get talked around an awful lot, but there's no real firm decision made, unless you've got a very forward player who just steps in, again, maybe going on a sort of OOC leader style that we were talking about, steps in and goes, right, we need to come up with a leader. Who's it going to be? Let's make that decision. Then let's crack on. I mean, in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game that myself and a few others played in, that Sean Connors ran, we got to a point a few sessions in where we were all really enjoying the game. He's a very good games master, great setting. We're all loving the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, but because we were enjoying our characters so much, we spent an awful lot of time sort of delving into the character backgrounds and sort of discussing them between ourselves, which is great fun, don't get me wrong. As all role players we'll all quite happily sit here and talk until like the cows come home about our favourite characters, especially when you've put time and effort into them. You want people to see that time and effort you've put in, and that's a good thing. But we were getting to the stage where we were saying, oh well, we're no further along with this plot than we were at the start of the session, and we've just spent like 4 hours effectively sat around making chit chat in character rather than getting out and stopping this evil cult from summoning up these demons to destroy a town, which we didn't actually manage to do, but that's a different story. But we got to the point where we, on the sort of Facebook group that had been set up for it, we all said, right, we obviously need some mechanism of, when things have been going on maybe a bit too long, having someone say, we should probably move this along, guys. So what we ended up with was myself at the start, because I said, right, well, I've not gone for a character who's going to be in any way an IC leader of the group, because I'm some sort of dwarven troll slayer who's just looking for a way to get himself killed in a suitably heroic death. Not what you really want for a party leader. So I'm quite happy to say, no, I'm not the in-character party leader. But I ended up basically saying, if at any point I say, right, guys, yeah, we probably need to get things back on track now, we'd all realise that, yeah, we've probably spent a bit too long dealing with this, and we'll try and like wrap things up as quickly as possible and move on to the next scene or whatever was going on. And that worked really well throughout the rest of the game, and other people started doing it as well. And it basically just came down to an agreement between us as the players eventually, that whenever anyone said, oh, we probably should crack on with this plot now, guys, or even just put it in the chat window so it didn't interfere with the actual sort of game, that we'd all sort of go, oh yeah, shit, we have been talking to this merchant for about like an hour and a half about the price of his cabbages. Yeah, let's move things along a bit.
I think 9 out of 10 of the solutions and advice that the 5 of us will end up giving will resolve itself in something like that, where you come into an out of character decision like, okay, this is what we're gonna do if we ever get like locked up in things that are not the story.
That's what I was gonna say. I wanted to say too about something to help, sort of the shy player take control is, information. And of course, for any character in any role-playing game, information is good, but out of character, give them information that, of course, is in character. That way, when they have to make a decision, they won't be like a deer in the headlights. They they will, they'll make the decision because they know all the elements in the equation, because regardless of your personality or your experience or your character or the game, I mean, if you're not familiar with what's going on, or if they just, use some in-character jargon that you don't know what that is, how are you supposed to make a decision? But, you can, and sometimes, it could maybe break the immersion a bit to, make that out-of-character comment, say, well, your character would know da-da-da-da-da. But I think that telling people that makes it more immersive, because then they can step back into their character with that knowledge that, in all honesty, if you're starting, whether it be the beginning of the campaign or the middle of it, but if someone's coming in as a commander character, to again go with that military example, or a nobleman or whatever, they're gonna be in the know. There's a reason that that they're the leader, unless they're not a good leader, and that's not gonna last very long. So, I think that giving them the in-character information out of character is probably the most important thing. And also, for any character, it's something you need to do. But for leaders and for anyone that you want to make a meaningful decision, because that's what I feel like as a GM, I'm always like, I give lots of decisions, and then sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't. It's like they didn't even care. They didn't even seem to see that I was giving them a decision. And it's like, well, it was probably because I didn't present it clearly enough that the stakes are high, or that something matters, or that you have a history with one of these organizations, or whatever it is. It's usually the GM's fault, not the players, when they're not excited about something. But of course, I sort of get throw my hands up in the air. Well, not in front of them, but.
Are you not respecting my game?
Definitely.
One good point that I don't think's been made yet is that everyone's talking about leaders as people who make choices. Which direction you're going to go in the group, what you're going to do next, that sort of stuff. But I mean, leaders can also be someone who they're more enablers for other people. They bring out the best in those around them, and I think having a character in the game that isn't necessarily a chief decision maker, but is someone that maybe out of character as well, gets people to sort of embrace the characters they're trying to play, and the niche things that they're really good at, and sort of bringing them all together to create more of a group, a sort of single unit that can tackle all these various different things, as opposed to one person leading a bunch of essentially just generic soldiers. They're playing on the strengths of other people. One of the things I liked about 4th edition was the leader role and some of the mechanics that used to enforce other characters, and sort of giving them not necessarily a free ride to shining, but giving them the means to, as if they made the decisions and built upon that, they could really start to excel. You could have essentially 5 people doing really great things, and I think other systems can do that as well. Pathfinder is a good one. I guess any system really. If in character they sort of remind both the players and the characters that we are a group, we're a solid unit. Unity and solidarity, and sort of not use them. I guess use them, yeah, because a good leader would use people for the niches that they're good at, the strengths that they're really good at, to overcome a challenge. Even if the DM does present that challenge to them and says, okay, you go into the Wizard's Tower, like, a leader might not develop then because you've got the end goal, you've got the path you want to walk down, but a leader could still develop in when you meet a challenge, they start to raise the level of other people essentially to get to that end goal. So they've still got an end goal. There's no sort of macro level choice being made, but there's still micro level choices being made by the other people, and the leaders sort of funneling that into them and then pushing it back out, kind of like a back and forth thing, which is another type of leader, I guess.
I was actually really wanting to bring that up in the conversation, and I'm so happy that you did it before me. Because you could, there's a lot of different things a leader could be. A leader could be a representative. A leader could take on a special role. They could be a delegator. They could be an organizer. or they could be a decision maker. And then there's tons of different areas or facets of the game or story in which they can be both in character and out of character, whether that's combat, social roles, negotiations, skills.
Well, I mean, I suppose if you look at a game like D&D or Pathfinder, etc., the whole idea of the character classes in D&D and Pathfinder sort of predispose the game towards each character having their particular niche where they're the authority almost on that particular thing. So if you want to talk about dealing with something in the straight up combat, obviously you've got your fighter. If you're looking for your more sort of religious wisdom or healing, you've got your clerics, etc. So, and I think there's a fair few other games where they sort of the character classes or the sort of types of character you can play sort of predispose you towards a certain role within the party. So it's maybe a natural thing that people take on those leadership roles at different points.
Well, for a time in Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't know, I mean, where this started, but the cleric was considered to be a solid party leader, and I think that was because, you know, exactly what Mike said. The cleric healed other people. You know, Tim Kearney at Tabletop Terrors posted a blog a while back about managing the spotlight, and I think that's exactly what you were talking about, Mike. You know, you can be a leader by taking a spotlight and putting it on the other characters. You know, not always on yourself. You know, but by saying, you know, my character wouldn't be necessarily a captain of the guard, but he would, you know, he might ask this other character, hey, where do you think we should go? You know, and then that kind of puts that decision on that other character, someone that is a leader, not in the meta sense, but in the game, because you're absolutely right that a leader in a game is not necessarily just someone that picks up the pieces that the GM is putting down and following the breadcrumbs. You know, a leader isn't someone that just, okay, guys, we've spent too much time at the market. You know, there's a lot of great role-playing options when it comes to playing a leader in a role-playing game.
I think it does raise a good question, though. I mean, has anyone actually run or played in a game where you have a different selection of leaders as opposed to a clearly defined one?
I think I'm playing in a game that Matt Click is running right now, and I think I cannot pick a single person that is the party leader. It's called the Provokers, and I think we all, in turn, we all have those spotlights that we're shining on each other and making decisions as a group, and I think we're good. We've all been GMs, and I feel like GMs make the best players because we know what we hate, and so we don't do it. You know, thing, so we don't spend a lot of time bickering. Well, I want to go to the shopping mall first. Well, when we go to the mall, I want to buy shoes. Well, no, I want to go to JCPenney and buy my shoes. It's like, oh, geez.
My character doesn't feel like adventuring today, guys. You'll have to convince me.
Yeah. There was an interesting moment in the Provokers, if I recall. You guys mentioned after you came out of the dungeon, right? You guys mentioned, like, during a social, I think it was when you first got back from the bar, maybe? Or maybe it was before that. I could be mixing up timeline. But you guys mentioned that WASD-20 was the party leader. His character was temporarily, or that he was supposed to be the face of the group.
Oh, really?
At some point.
Maybe,
and then he ended up kind of not
soldier.
doing that. Yes. And then he ended up kind of not doing that.
I remember looking at my character sheet and saying, oh, I have a high charisma. I'm going to make an inspirational speech. And so, you know, that begs the question, you know, for you guys, you know, a leader, is a leader where do you find your leaders? Do you find them in the person or on the character sheet?
So it's a very good question. I mean, I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier, where how are people's out of character qualities transferable to the in character sort of game space and vice versa? Because it's all very well for me to say, oh, I'm going to play some noble who has massively high charisma. I can melt people's hearts and win over armies of thousands of men with my stirring speeches. But if I'm, as a player, barely able to like string together a couple of sentences, it becomes a lot more difficult for the other players and for the GM to imagine that sort of character doing it. Not impossible, of course, because you can make roles for it and you can make allowances for the abilities, but I think it's certainly more convincing if someone can at least make an attempt at doing something when it's diplomacy or something like that, rather than just sort of saying, I'm going to make an inspirational speech, roll those dice.
Yeah, exactly. It can become bland very easily.
I think it's the difference between having to hear what someone says and, them standing up and sort of pacing around the room and giving the speech, or more a case of what someone says. Like I stand in front of the troops, I tell them that this is their land, these are their, their children, their people, their civilians, and that these foreign invaders need to understand that we are not going to bend over and take it. So, rally with me, because whatever happens, I'm going into that army. And I sort of went into a dialogue there a little bit, and which completely brought the point. But what I mean is that you've got two types of high charisma players. You've got the ones that will deliver that speech, Barker, for example, and other ones who will sort of tell the DM or detail what they would say and what highlights they would bring up. And I think both are just as good. And depending on the DM, they may ask for a role, they may not.
Yeah, I mean, I know certainly in games I've run where I've had people who are playing higher charisma characters, but they're maybe not the most comfortable with giving speeches. If they can generally give an outline, as you say, of what they're doing, you can then fall back on saying, oh, well, okay, so that's the gist of what you're saying. Make your diplomacy roll or your inspiration roll or whatever it is, and you can run with that result, which I'm absolutely fine with. I'd rather someone make an attempt at it and not I'm not expecting them to give the best speech in the world. Not everyone's amazingly good orator. That's absolutely fine, and nor should you have to be. It's a game at the end of the day. But as long as someone makes the effort, I'm sort of quite appreciative of a GM of them trying to do that and of them trying to sort of step up and do that, even if they do just give an outline. Whereas someone who just sort of sits back and really doesn't seem to be even bothered to tell you the gist of the speech. They're just like, I need this army on side. I'm going to stand up in front of them, ride up on my horse, give a speech. Right, I've got a plus 18 in diplomacy or whatever. As soon as that starts happening, I'm like, oh, no, I'm not really buying that. Whereas if they do, as you say, give the outline, they don't have to give the whole 3-hour speech or whatever. That's fine. Life's too short. But as long as they at least make the effort, I'm sort of quite willing to run with that as a GM.
Just to get okay, I'm going to give a speech. I've just made some notes.
Oh, goodness.
Please create for me a PowerPoint presentation outlining your speech.
I approve of your use of index cards.
I think it's always good to have levels and layers too, because not only is it interesting, but I think in real life that's how it is. Just because the king is the king doesn't necessarily mean that I mean, what does he base his decisions off of? His counselors, the people that come to him, maybe his wife, maybe his mother, maybe his son, who knows? But I think that regardless of who you are, even the commander in a military force, the nobleman, the head of a household, no one operates in a vacuum unless you're just a crazy person, in which case you probably won't be a leader for long. People make their decisions obviously based on people that are around them and that they care about and that they love. And sort of like in Game of Thrones, you'll see a lot of times that the person that from the outside perspective, if you're a peasant in Westeros, your perspective of the head of a household and the person who's actually calling the shots seldom times is it actually that person, or are they doing it for the reasons that you think that they're doing it? And I think that real life is that way. I mean, it's fine enough when you're just going dungeon delving and you're just a bunch of opportunists looking to come up in the world and survive another day, then yeah, just do whatever you got to do. But I think that for NPCs and player characters, that even the leaders have perhaps strange bedfellows in their that share some of that leadership role. I'm not saying that it's an outright manipulation like Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings necessarily, but just someone that you hold in high regard. Perhaps your medic that you've grown close with, who's sewn you up again and again on the battlefield for the past 2 decades. You probably trust that guy and his opinion quite a bit. maybe more so than your own perception, even. You know, so to have those sort of, I think, reveals, especially for NPCs, will make it a lot more interesting. Because you always want to, oh, let's speak to who's in charge, and then, well, maybe the guy that's in charge doesn't actually know, or maybe he's, you know, incompetent, or maybe he's perfectly competent, but in all actuality, you need to speak to, you know, the guy behind the scenes or whoever it is.
And what John said earlier, especially with Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, you know, the classes that they make are, you know, I mean, well, basically, this is how you murder people. This class right there, you stab them in the back, or you kill them with a sword, or you chop them with an axe. But each of them have kind of these skill sets. So, you know, if you want to know more about this temple, you're going to ask the cleric. If you want to know more about, you know, this type of trap that might be in this hall, you're going to ask the rogue, etc. So everybody, I think, has the chance to be a leader in their own right, just based on what is on their character sheet.
I mean, it's a good point. I mean, we've just been talking about the various characteristics that we think might be useful for a leader, and the difference between sort of like an in-character leader and an out-of-character leader. If it comes to an in-character leader, though, it's obviously, as John said, it's easy to make an informed decision sort of in character if you have a history with the potential leader or the NPCs or whatever. Now, I've certainly noticed in a few games that I've played in recently, games where they attempt to set up an existing sort of relationship between the player characters when you start. I mean, the most obvious one I can think of are the various sort of Apocalypse World and Dungeon World variants, where literally on your character sheet you have a small paragraph or series of sentences where it will have blanks for you to fill in character names, and it might be something like so-and-so owes me his life, and you write down another player, and immediately that sort of gets you thinking, well, why do they owe me their life? What happened there? And that's part of the whole character creation process. Do you guys, when it comes to creating characters at the start, in your own games, do you try and create a sort of background where these people already know each other so they can go in straight away and make that informed decision? Or do you maybe just prefer to throw them in and let them meet each other in the game? Chappie, I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, you could learn from a few games that kind of already do that. Like Rain, the entire game is based off of every single person being a leader, essentially, of their own organization. So, like you said, Barker, with how classes are designed, everyone has the opportunity to be a leader. So as long as that opportunity is there, then you know, you could be the situational leader. That tends to work very well. So yes, setting up characters to be able to possibly be the leader works very well with character creation. Something like How We Came to Live Here. Sorry, I'm just plugging different games that I can.
You're just shilling now. You're just shilling.
Material you can pass it.
Sorry, plug in the niche games, man. So good.
How much are they paying you, man?
No, none. I just want players.
Ironically, there's a man with a suit passing you all these on the other side.
Mm-hmm. I wish. I would gladly take that money. I'm broke. No. But with games like that, yeah, they're very enriched when you have when you form those leadership roles ahead of time, and it's very important to always do that ahead of time. I think Barker said it, when to have consensus in the group with how things are run. It's that whole social contract thing. You need to, if everyone's not on board, then things are going to get derailed or demolished or destroyed in some form or fashion, because we don't like being told what to do because we're human. And but yeah, there are different ways you can do that. If two characters have already established that relationship and they agree with that, and out of character and social contract, that works. If you give both of them individual roles, like they both have influence over each other in certain ways, or if you do it in the classic D&D way where everybody's kind of an expert or have the opportunity to be a leader in their own area, those tend to be the easiest ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I've noticed it just more recently, but I seem to remember when I first started role-playing, more of the games I played in were sort of, you've genned your characters, now part of the first session is going to be you guys meeting up, forming your adventuring party or whatever it would be in the game, then you crack on with the game and you do the adventure, whereas more of the systems I've noticed recently, Numenera, Dungeon Board, various other ones, sort of pre-propose that idea that you already actually have some connections with each other, so you've already got an established bond between the characters, to just sort of jumpstart you straight into it without having that whole sort of slightly awkward sort of party meetup scene.
I think there's pros and cons on both sides. Like, you know, having it pre-prepared and knowing where everyone stands is obviously good because it gives you a great starting off point. Especially for like a one-shot, you need that sort of a thing. But I feel like players will care more about something if they're invested in it, and if they are the ones who, at least if they feel like they came up with the decision, or we're the ones that, like, you know, that did this. But I think it just depends, you know, it depends on the group, that age-old answer, because if you have a bunch of players that are gung-ho to really play their characters and get things going, and of course out of character they know that they're going to be a party, then they're going to do what it takes to make that party work. You just need to sort of set them up in a scene together, and they'll make the magic happen. And then they'll care more about it because they were the ones that did it. It's not something that is written down on their sheet. Granted, sure, even if you choose it at character creation, you have a bit of, you know, you were the one that chose it, but still it has little meaning to you other than everything else other than, oh, I also have a sword. I also have 2 points in diplomacy. I mean, you have backgrounds for the reasons that you have those too, but until you get sessions in where you've, you know, deposed the king with that sword, the sword's not going to really mean much to you. So, you know, I think there's pros and cons both ways, but I believe that if you're going to but if you expect the players to do that without telling them that, you know, it's dependent on them being good role players. So
I think your point about investment's a very good one. I mean, certainly I know the one-off Cthulhu game that you ran for us, that I will pursue you to run the second session of, even if I have to sort of like emerge from like a corner of your room like Hound of Tindalos style and haunt you until you do it. In that game, my only achievement in the entire game sort of, as playing like a sort of a young lad who's hoping to save up to go to college, was rescuing someone's lost dog and sort of taking a small dog back to, and I was like absolutely like over the moon about that sort of in character and really enjoyed it out of character, despite the fact that there's all manner of horrible things going on in the background. There's some deep ones or something similar like emerging from between the floorboards, or the characters are like fleeing to churches and begging the Lord for help, and I'm just sort of strutting around with a big smile on my face because I've rescued some sort of lost dog that was out in the rain, which had, as far as I'm aware, had very little to do with the rest of the plot. But because you're invested in that character, it's the sort, I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's the sort of the small victories for your character that sort of build on that enjoyment in the session. And I think it's, when we're talking about a sort of party leader, to sort of bring it back to the point of the hangout, it's maybe, as you guys have all said, not the big sort of overarching decisions that the leader makes that sort of make a good leader. It's those small little things they do that facilitate the enjoyment of the game for themselves and other people, and maybe even for the GM themselves. Obviously, GMs, you get a better game if the GM's enjoying running the game at the end of the day. I was going to say, as my next question, how important do you feel it is that someone who's a group leader have a good working relationship with the GM? Obviously, we know that if they're going to be a party leader, they need a good relationship with the other player characters, because they need to, otherwise they won't follow them, they won't listen to what they're saying, and you may as well not be the leader in that case. how important do you think it is, guys, to have a good working relationship with the actual games master, the person who's running the game?
It's kind of necessary because otherwise you get an uprising, which has happened to me. Um, without, and I was like, I don't know what I did, and suddenly, apparently I'm against you now. I thought I was trying to build a good story with you, but that one guy who was the party leader decides to be an insurgent, I guess, for reasons of which are beyond which I can understand. So if someone has like pride issues, or is just that kind of person, they'll just start crap just to start crap. If they're the party leader, then then it can go awry.
I mean, the other good thing as well is that if you do have a party leader and they do have a good working relationship with the DM, you and that player can work together to sort of form either new storylines, new narrative lines that the group can start on and stuff like that. And I think if that player is also working with the other players, he's the sort of representative of the group to the DM, so he can channel anything the players might discuss about. Because one of the things that players will do is talk about the game, and sometimes they'll be like, it'd be so cool if we could fight an army of orcs. And then that leader, the party leader, can come to the DM and say, oh, well, you know, your blog said this about fighting an army of orcs, and the DM can go away and think, you know, that's a pretty cool idea, and he can work it in, and then you've sort of got, I mean, you're literally building a story together at that point. The leader might know or not know that you're planning on throwing this party of the army of orcs at them, but if it's something they've talked about as a group without the DM, and then it happens, they'll feel cool, and you've told pretty much, you've delivered on the enjoyment level pretty much at that point. And the only reason you've done that, the only way you could do that, is because of this sort of flow of information going from the large group through one person back to the DM. And if you keep it up, then, you know, you're bound to have a good campaign, really.
You know, a campaign, at least in my group, is a round table kind of coalition to build a story. A lot of people do, you know, players versus the DM, and some games, if you're playing like Paranoia, that's kind of mandatory. Otherwise, you know, that's the way I prefer it, is you know, a group of people building a story together. I like to be put surprised and be put on my toes as much as I think I would put the players on their toes. Every single opinion I think I've said is spawned with a horror story, and I've had the player that is very smart, very creative. He might even be watching this now. We actually had to ask him to leave the group because you know, he's just a super smart guy, but you know, he viewed every single possible story or obstacle or goal as railroading. And so his objective seemed to be to, you know, poke a bunch of holes in the plot. And I feel like trust is the most important thing. Not necessarily a friendship with the GM, but where you guys can trust each other. Sometimes I will ask my players, okay, you walk into this room, what do you see? And then they will tell me what they see, and then we'll go from there. You know, I think that the first time I did that, Sean Vigvari, Gaming Beast 82, I asked him what he saw in a room, and he said, oh, a +5 Vorpal sword. And then it just kind of paused, and then he said, okay, never mind, I see a bookcase. You know, I mean, just really, I mean, and then, you know, I would name the book that he found on it or something, just to kind of collectively build that world together, and everybody's the leader in that way. In that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something I've done in my most recent Dungeon World campaign, where pretty much the entire campaign world has been built from the players picking their race and their sort of class, which are all very similar to the sort of D&D classes, and then me saying, oh, so you're playing an elven druid, tell me what the elves are like in this setting, and how do they view druids within their society? Are they highly placed? Are they seen as weird sort of loners out on the fringes of society? And then going to the next character and saying, oh, well, how do they... You've said you're from a northern tribe. How are the Northland humans? What are they like? How do they relate to the other societies that we're built up? And just sort of linking them all together and building. Granted, only for a mini campaign, I'd have probably gone into more detail if it was a longer running campaign. But that entire campaign world was just built from asking the players what they thought their particular area of expertise, their particular sort of area of involvement with the world was like, and then how they could all link together, and that seemed to have worked really well. So I thoroughly support that whole idea of a collaborative process to create a world.
And leaders emerge from that, by the way. You can put a bunch of people around a table and have this collection of people building a world together, and your party leader will most often appear out of nowhere. You'll realize, okay, this is the person that is going to be the captain or whatever. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mike. What was that?
No, I was pretty much going to echo that. Or reverb. I forget which one.
You were going to reverb it? Yeah.
I think it's the players, like, when they start building a world like that together, you'll usually get, as they're building it, they'll know more about it, it's their own creation. The DMs get the credit. But the players will be more invested, so they're more likely to sort of be a lot more proactive. And I think one of the key ingredients to being any type of leader is being very proactive, and I think that sort of grows that very proactive attitude. And if I say proactive one more time, apparently I get a free coffee. But it's sort of like that very proactive attitude can get them. I've farted. If they are active in a pro kind of way, they can feel very much more like they're making more decisions. And if they start making more decisions, as you said, leaders will start to develop in the group organically in a very proactive kind of fashion.
See, I think you're shilling now for face wash stuff, face soap.
Another way that I just thought about it now that sort of leadership can pertain around a table, a bit tangential but definitely related, is you know, when you have new people at the table or people that are new to your group, having your friend, this probably wouldn't work as well online over Hangouts and such, but having your friend or experienced player sort of, you know, be the example role player. And maybe you don't necessarily tell, you know, everyone that, but, you know, one-on-one, maybe you tell that person that, you know, hey, you know, just do your thing and, you know, do it confidently. Even, I'm not saying that they necessarily have a leader character, but they're going to role play to the nines or really show off however, you know, because they know your style, they know what you're going for, and the other players will, you know, see that and fall into it, and it will make them feel very comfortable. So you won't have that in character and out of character sort of first session, you know, hands in your pocket, shuffle in your shoes, staring at the wall, kind of like, well, what's gonna happen next? You know, a little too slow paced. You can have that guy, and you know, quite often that player is probably you know, a GM in and of their own right, which is why they're, you know, more than willing to step up to the plate right off the bat. But I think having that guy there is good for that reason. I don't know if you guys have experienced anything like that.
I've been that guy once or twice. I had to be. Sometimes my gaming options only involve being around people who play Pathfinder and World of Warcraft and play Pathfinder in a very World of Warcraft kind of way. And so in order to encourage storytelling and role-playing, I kind of have to be that guy from time to time. Oh, it's also nice to have that one, the one sensible person who can help in a very polite way steer troublemakers, like, in a good direction. Like, people whose only goal is to burn down every single town and building. Be like, what about this thing that has to actually do with the plot instead of just burning down this random tavern that we're in? The serial arsonists are fun players. But it's nice to have another player who has the GM's back who can help in character steer them in at least a constructive way.
I can't really say anything given the amount of sort of burning towns we've had to leave behind us in Jenny's Advanced Fighting Fantasy game, to the point where almost every session, to my mind, ends with us returning to the ship that we're travelling about on, and John's character, the sort of like flamboyant pirate captain, gazing in despair at the sort of smoke like lifting into the air like over the horizon. And it always seems to happen in some like entirely random way as well, where we've not deliberately set out to, like, yes, torch everything, burn this place to the ground. but it always seems to end up with whatever happens, we either end up getting evicted from the town or like the town burns down behind us. Although we are trying to like wean ourselves off that. We're on like a 3-stage program where we've got it down to like burning just villages now. We're hoping to move on to hamlets next and then wean ourselves off it entirely. Probably with some sort of like charcoal flavoured chewing gum or something similar.
Maybe just stick to burning a single sheep in a field every once in a while. Just that one poor sheep.
That's it. Yeah. We knew it sort of like become an in-game joke where we were saying, "Oh, why don't we go out and help you pursue your career of like piracy on the Seven Seas? Because that involves being surrounded by water. We can't burn that. I'm pretty sure water is not burnable." And immediately, sort of like myself and another player character looking at our sort of spell list and going,
Well,
technically. But yeah, I do think sometimes you do need someone to maybe jumpstart things, or someone who will sort of push things beyond that whole sort of like slash and burn mentality. Now, one of you guys mentioned the idea of a sort of a more sort of sandboxy game earlier on. I was going to raise a point of, do we think that a leader is more or necessary? I'm not really fond of the terms of sandbox or railroaded type game, since I think they're very sort of simplistic terms. But for lack of better terms, do we think that a leader would be more or less necessary in a sandbox as opposed to a railroaded game?
I think that part of me wants to just jump out and say they're equally necessary, but you find them in a different way depending on whether it's a sandbox or a railroad. I mean, sandbox I feel like would be important because if you don't have a leader, then well, it's actually no. I would say it's more difficult to find one in the sandbox because it's very easy for your players to discover. Man, I have this freedom right off the bat. I can do what I want. It's a sandbox world, and then so they can do different things. All your players can start going their separate ways, and that quickly can destroy a campaign. On a railroaded one, it's you find a leader, and that's difficult to pick or keep a leader in the railroad because I think that goes back to the out-of-character people around the table being like, no, I want to be the leader, or I don't really, I want to be the person that kind of breaks from the leader and is suspicious of the leader. And while that can create some great story opportunities, it can also, set things on fire.
Quite literally.
Yeah. Like I said, everything is born from a horror story. In an RPG, so
yeah, that's pretty true. I mean, I think I'll probably speak for almost every role player when anytime you watch a video where someone mentions a particularly bad situation, you immediately think, oh yeah, I've been in a game where that's happened. And let's face, I mean, I certainly enjoy watching the sort of the RPG horror story videos that many different channels put up, and I think everyone sort of has those. Oh, why did the rest of the party have to like set fire to that gunpowder store at the back of the town? Sort of a story. Or, oh, why did someone throw a fireball in that direction and like not realise the cart was full of dynamite or whatever? Sort of story. Well, I mean, I don't know about yourself, Mike. How do you think a game leader is? How do you think the importance varies when it's a sandbox or a railroaded game?
I think with a railroad game, the macro decisions are taken out of hand more because the DM is sort of pushing the adventure a bit along. Like the goals are a lot more clearly defined. You run in modules and things like that. You've got a very I don't want to say a linear path because you can have branching and sort of circular kind of paths and stuff, but your paths are very much set. So you're basically just choosing which train to take to the end. With a sandbox game, I think leaders naturally develop. At first, with a new group, it might be a little awkward because the DM might poke them a little bit, but eventually they'll start to understand and feel more confident with making decisions. Completely out of the blue, someone might say, well, let's go to the east because there might be job opportunities, and they might travel there. So they're turned into a leader at that point. And with the sort of open dynamics that you get with a sandbox, choices are very key, because otherwise the DM has no way to adjudicate any of the consequences that happen. So the choices being made comes to the whole idea that, you know, leaders make difficult choices or they take responsibility for choices. So if someone says, let's go in those caves, because, you know, like 10 sessions back we heard there were a bunch of caves there, so we might go and find some treasure, and they run into, you know, a clan of hooked horrors or something like that, and 2 party members die and one of them gets away with losing an arm, that leader's going to have to take responsibility from that. And ideally, like, you know, you can introduce some sort of party tension there, and having that party leader and that sort of party politics wouldn't happen if the person hadn't made a decision and taken the leadership role. So I think in a sandbox game, it'll develop both naturally, whether it's a single clearly defined one or sort of a group of people making a decision, maybe 2, or everybody making the decision, but essentially a leader will develop in a sandbox. It kind of has to, because otherwise, you know, like you said, you'd be spending a couple of sessions doing 3 hours in a tavern. DMs can push it a little bit in a sandbox game, but if they do it too much, it turns from a sandbox into a more railroad, and defeats the whole point of a sandbox, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think with sandboxes as a GM, you can certainly throw a lot of choices out there, and you can seed all manner of different sort of plots that are visible to players in the background. But as you rightly say, Mike, at the end of the day, if the players choose to sit in that tavern rather than go out and pursue those plots, then you're in that situation again where, to coin your phrase, you do need someone a bit more proactive to go out there and actually sort of pursue things, and maybe they would develop into a party leader. So in terms of actual party leaders, what do people think would be the necessary, if you're going to make the ideal party leader, what would be the characteristics that you think that leader would need?
Well, I think that, you know, like you guys were saying, leaders can come in many different shapes and forms, and they could have many skills, or even a lack perhaps of some, you know, a leader that's maybe not that charismatic and has no diplomacy could be very, very rewarding and definitely doable and very fun to play. So, sorry, I just sort of lost my my train of thought there for a second. Yeah, I can't remember where I was going with that.
That's right. I thought that was a good start, though. I thought, but
yeah, what was the question again?
The question was, what would you say that the qualities are that are necessary?
Oh, yes. You could, yeah, that's right. You could have a leader, you know, of virtually any skill set. But I think the one thing, like Mike was saying, and maybe Barker too, that you have to have is that they have to be sort of sensitive to those around them. They have to be able to pick up on the emotions and sort of the attitude of those around them. Because the number one thing I think about a leader is they have to keep those under them happy. At least happy enough to not want to go and do something else or depose them. And I think that's where really the main probably challenge comes with being a leader, because, you know, I suppose with, you know, it's a bit of a greater reward maybe, but it's also more, you're asking more of a player. Just like being a GM is more rewarding than being a player, but it's also asking quite a bit more of you. So I think that that's really, in my eyes, the one thing that any good leader should have, regardless of, you know, anything else, is that they should be able to pick up on things from other people and sort of be able to read at least to those that they know. Maybe not everyone that they come across, but I don't know. That's my thoughts on it.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on the qualities that a party leader might require?
Yeah, DMJ's video about all good players are flexible, I think, was the name of the video. He just talks about the best players are the ones that bring in other players into what's going on, and they're open-ended to everything. No, it's all good players are inclusive. That's the name of the video. So a very inclusive personality, a person that brings in other characters and other people and involves them into the action. So it's the same thing with as Spank and Spitz, because I don't really know what to call you, so I'll just call you Spank and Spitz for now.
There are two Johns here. Too many Johns.
Too many Johns. Too many Johns. But what he brought up was you want the leader to exemplify role-playing earlier, like in the earlier question. So it's just you want that leader to model good player behavior. So being an inclusive player, you know, bringing other players in, or just being a good role player in general are all good qualities for a party leader.
And piggybacking off of that, I think, you know, the best leaders are the ones that take the punch. The example is when we were playing in the backyard as kids and saying, you know, I hit you. No, you didn't. I dodged it. And then I hit you. No, I blocked it. You know, and no one ever gets hit because nobody wants their masculinity diminished by being punched. No, the best leader is the one where if another character says, I punch him in the face, the immediate response is, you know, I fall to the floor and kind of falter and shake it off and stand back up. You know, someone who takes the hit and someone who can role play being a real person. And I think that not only does that work in game, but out of character on some sort of meta level, other players, I find, will have much less of a problem following that person because they're real. I don't know, maybe they can, I don't know why. I'm sure there's a psychology experiment somewhere in that.
And that's always what people remember, isn't it? You know, when Romeo and Juliet, you always think about Mercutio. That's the one thing that you, at least me, and I think a lot of people, that's the most interesting character because of that reason, because he died, you know?
Yeah. I love that. I just imagine Boromir's player saying, you know what, I want to die in this scene, you know? I want to die in the scene as a leader, and then he got to re-roll, what was it, probably Aomer or something. I want to ride a horse. Come on. I want to ride a horse.
Well, it's that whole thing with, they say people always remember characters, NPCs, for their flaws, and I think we've spoke a bit about the GM horror stories. So expanding that idea is that those are sort of very flawed sessions. It's the flaws and the sort of complications that sort of stay with you in a game. And obviously you remember the triumphs and the successful missions and the great characters and their sort of noble moments. But there's something about a moment when you had a character die in a particular dramatic way, or maybe they fell victim to a particularly horrific trap, or some sort of plot complication came back and sort of bit your character, that we all sort of remember long after the sort of the triumphs and the. I don't know whether that's just part of human nature, but I think it's the same as you say for leaders. Anyone who's got sort of flaws that they're willing to actually role play with, you sort of look at them and you say, oh, they're obviously a good role player because they're role playing these flaws out. So you're more willing to actually go along with them.
One of the leaders into the game that we're playing at the moment, the guy who's playing a paladin, and he developed as a leader, and people are behind him pretty well. But before that, a big event happened that sort of gave him his call into a paladin. Before that, he was a bit more of a sort of lug-headed barbarian. Still kind of a nice heart. But he was also a new player, and he decided early that his character had no idea about magic because he didn't know about magic in the system. There was a chase scene, and the person who they were chasing laid a trap, which was a delayed fireball, which is described as being a tiny little bead that glows slightly for a number of rounds. Being a player and a character that knew nothing about magic, his first response when he saw this was to pick it up and investigate it. The fireball went off and took his hand, and we still talk about that now. But it was like, even as he was making that decision to pick it up, he was like sort of saying to the group, you know, I know this is a bad idea. I know this is not going to be good because nothing good ever happens in games. And he picked it up. And he went with it because he said there's no reasonable way he wouldn't just pick it up to look at it because he doesn't know what it is. And I mean, we still joke about it now, but I think that's one of the things, him being willing to play his character like that and make those, I don't want to say the wrong decisions, but interesting decisions is probably one of the reasons why he's a leader at the moment.
Yeah, I mean,
the triumphs and successes seem exponentially more powerful after the failures. You know, without the failures, triumphs and successes can just become the norm, and that's not, that's not the most. That's not the best thing for a good story.
I entirely agree. I think if you're constantly always succeeding at challenges, you almost become a little bit blasé about it. Oh yeah, I've defeated another army of orcs, or I've brought another evildoer to justice. Whereas if you've really had to struggle against the odds to get to that sort of end goal, you value it more because it didn't come easily.
The rest is a lot more satisfying at the top of the mountain after the climb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not sure how much it kind of, again, piggybacks off of the leadership role discussion, but, when I watched The Fellowship of the Ring, sorry about spoilers, every time Boromir dies at the end, the book's been out so many years, whatever, spoilers, every time Boromir dies at the end, I'm weeping. My wife is next to me just staring at me. I'm crying, not because he dies, but because of the dichotomy between him at the beginning and him at the very end, calling Aragorn his king. So, and, leaders are not, the gods among men. I find that leaders are the people who are chaotic evil, and then as an example, but then they show that minor chaotic good tendency right in the middle of it, and then it's like, man, that guy is a real person. The ones with those dichotomies. Bad example with the chaotic evil, but someone with some sort of growth.
No, and I think you definitely see that with Han Solo. I think in fact Onion Kid 99 talked about it on his video in alignment that Han Solo starts out as chaotic neutral. He's out for himself. End of story. That very very simple. And then by the end of the first movie, he's moving towards chaotic good, and then that's pretty much where he remains for the rest of the trilogy. It's a pretty good example, I think.
There was a TED Talk or something like that about literary theory, and it said it boils down to... sorry, you're just shaking your head. It boils down to villains are the people that honestly think of themselves as better than others. And the hero is... That's the ultimate separation between a hero and a villain, is that a hero honestly doesn't think of themselves as better than others, while a villain does. In a lot of stories. And that seems to bode well to all the conversations you had with the leaders, is that the leader embodies that. You don't want the guy that's a douchebag and totalitarian, like just totally dominates the party and thinks he's the great leader. That's the people that everyone wants to take down, right? It's the leader. It's the leader that thinks that they don't deserve it, that they want to see succeed. That's what they get behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think taking the whole Star Wars example that Skankenspitz put forward, if you took one of the sort of major characters, if you took Darth Vader and erased all of his background and just said, oh, he's just some guy in black armor who wanders around doing like the Emperor's bidding and like killing people with merry abandon, that wouldn't be anywhere near such a memorable character, because you know that originally he didn't start off like that, and he shows that sort of spark of goodness at the end of the sort of like original film trilogy. Whereas if he'd just been sort of like generic evil sort of lieutenant all the way through, whereas Black Armor has red lightsaber and just continued serving the Emperor all the way through, I don't think he'd have been anywhere near as memorable a character as he eventually turned out to be.
Quick question. Back to the party leaders discussion that I posted it in the chat here because it kind of just popped in my brain. You guys, I've not had this experience. Have any of you ever used an NPC, a non-player character, as a leader in the game? And if so, how do you successfully do it without that NPC just becoming the nudger? Go here, no, go there, pick that up, don't pick that up. Have any of you had a decent, successful experience with that? or a bad experience? 'Cause
I mean, I managed to do that once in the game, the first Pathfinder game we started, where I literally just put them on the road and said, "You head into that town, do what you want." And it was a case of they stayed in the town. One of the first people they met was a captain of the guard, and he turned into a leader. Not always with the group, but they would go and see him. One or two of the characters started to really get attached to him and everything. And the way I did that was not so much turning him into a like a Mary Sue kind of character who wasn't this brilliant at everything, and he didn't have all the answers. But it's an old psychology trick when you are in a session with someone and they ask you a question, you don't necessarily answer it rather than just repeat the question back to them in a different way. And that's kind of what he did. So just by being there as someone to bounce ideas off, the players themselves and the characters would eventually come to a decision about what to do. And I mean, that group started off, we didn't have any direction because we were just sort of testing the waters for a new group. The campaign is still going, and it turned out one of the characters at the time, who was a bit of a nasty thing, turned into that sort of very evil, I think I'm better than everyone else kind of thing. Eventually, the group killed that character, and it was 2 or 3 sessions of sort of splitting the Skype call, because we play over Roll20, splitting the Skype call of them making these chess moves against each other. It was really enjoyable. I guess I would say that as a DM, yeah. But it was really enjoyable, and it turned out into a showdown with everyone present. The paladin guy, who's now the leader, squared off against this rogue who was, like a undead worshipping cannibal. And he killed him, and they sort of got led to that direction, I think, with this other guy sort of, when they were talking about, he's making these really odd things that we're not really comfortable with, and he would just repeat the question. So, you don't feel comfortable with his methods, and they go, yeah, I think we should do something drastic about it. What do you think? And it's like, well, I think, doing something needs to be done about it if you're uncomfortable with it. So it's a very passive kind of way of getting them to, I guess, without realizing it, become their own leaders, in a way, coming to their own decisions, which was kill him. And they did, and it was a good moment, because we still talk about that main fight and stuff, and that character was given to the DM, which is always fun. But essentially, it was, you have the leader who becomes a leader and starts having all these questionable motives and these questionable methods, and then this other guy who was also like the barbarian. He was very questionable. He was very, I don't mind killing people, like they're just people. In that journey, one of them continued on that path and stayed as that sort of villainous, I'm better than everyone else. The other guy took the different route and became more of a sort of like, I'm starting to see good things in this world, and the reason why I don't mind killing people probably is because of all the stuff that's happened in the past. And it's nice to see that the group followed the one that started to get a bit of a redemption, as opposed to the one that was not on that path.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of using NPCs, I've only really done it in a similar way to Mike, where I've sort of kept it very general, more as a sort of sounding board for the players rather than an actual NPC coming in and saying, right, okay, we're going to do this. As Mike was rightly saying, you can sort of turn a question around and almost use it as a prompt to get the players to make their own decisions, where they say, oh, should we go and explore that abandoned castle on the hill? And you can say, oh, well, I've heard this about it, and then drop in a few extra bits of plot hint, but you don't actually have the leader say, yes, let's tool up and go straight and kick some goblin ass in that castle on the hill. You still let the players make their own decision. Also, another good thing to do with an NPC leader, and I'll admit it's a cheap trick to do, but if it works, I'll take a cheap trick every day of the week, is to, as Mike said, either have that NPC later sort of go down that darker path and become that sort of villainous NPC, where the players can look at them and say, oh, well, that could have easily been my character if circumstances had been a bit different. or you have the NPC sort of be one of the first soldiers to fall in their sort of adventures, just to sort of show that it is a dangerous place, that so that once the players have established themselves a bit more and they can then maybe take over that leadership role a bit more themselves, you can not only remove that NPC in a nice sort of tidy fashion and get some more plot out of it, but you can also use their deaths to sort of like spur the player characters on and sort of push them off in their own direction.
Kind of like that spotlight theory that was mentioned before. You know, if none of the players' characters are shining the spotlight on other people, it might be an excellent piece of advice for any viewers to, hey, have an NPC walk in and spotlight the players if the players aren't doing it themselves.
That's actually what I did in my Stalker one-shot through Boris. I've actually done this quite a bit, perhaps too much. Probably.
How many times have you had your NPCs get kidnapped?
Several.
Nice.
It's always the leader NPC. It's always the leader NPC. Nobody wants. But a few tricks that when they aren't killed that I've noticed that worked. You
don't want to do it too often. Your characters are going to meet someone and be like, all right, how long till this guy gets kidnapped?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm very light with my NPCs now because I've had too many horror stories. Never use NPCs I actually enjoy role playing. That's I used to be in like freeform role playing, and it's even worse than that when people don't feel like they're bound by any dice rolls. Sometimes things can get pretty hasty. But when they actually work, there's a few tricks you can use. There's the sounding board that you guys mentioned. Another cool, not really cool, but lazy way of doing it is just saying what you already know that they're thinking. If you use that NPC as a way of kind of coaxing thought out of them, like they'll say something ambiguous, and then the players have to interpret that for themselves. Then you automatically know by their interpretation of what they just said, like say he gives a riddle or he speaks of some fond generality, then based on their interpretation you know what they're thinking, and so you can use that to basically tell the players what they already know or what they want to hear. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is making the guy give incentives. So it's always conditional, but it's like like the payment. You know that getting to know and going along with this NPC is actually rewarding, or it's going to be helpful with what their goals already are. So they're kind of like, we're going with it, but for our own reasons, kind of thing.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Is it comes back to player investment, kind of like Mike's example. That would probably, at least me sitting here today, right now, I would say that would probably maybe be the only time that I would have rather even really have an NPC as a leader, as if it just sort of evolved and came to be, and out of the player's volition, not my own. There's actually another example in my current game, is in the Changeling game. Changeling Society government works. There's 4 courts, one for each season, and as the seasons turn, every 3 months a new court comes into power. So I think about 3/4 of the people in the group are in the Spring Court, and they ended up going to see the Queen of the Spring Court to, of course, just get information about whatever the main plot was. And while they were there, one of the characters was like, do you need anything else? They were all, pretty excited in and out of character to interact with, the leader of the court. But one in particular voiced that, like, hey, is there anything I could do for you? And changelings are all about agreements and contracts and pledges and stuff. So, of course the leader's like, well, there's nothing on hand, but I am the leader of the Court of Desire, so I'm sure that I could figure something out. So, essentially they entered a pledge that he's going to do, his queen a favor, and, so she's becoming more important, and she's going to issue him something that probably won't be, intrinsically related to him or his background in any way, but hopefully he'll care about it because he's the one that asked for it. And he didn't tell me that out of character, just in character. He just wanted to do that, and I was like, You know, why am I going to deny you that? It's gonna make the NPC more important to you, and you're gonna have, you know, ostensibly a quest or a burden or, you know, an errand that you have to run or whatever you have to do that, you know, that I don't have to push on you. You asked for it, and hopefully, you know, they'll want more of that. So then they'll build this relationship where they're a willing servant to this queen, you know, or not, whatever they want to do.
I think one of my problems with NPCs as a potential group leader, and this may just be down to how I do NPCs, I don't know, is I think the temptation there is, as an NPC, as a GM, we spend an awful lot of time as GMs talking during a role-playing session, describing stuff to the players, narrating what's going on in the background. I think when you're an NPC leader as well, you can almost end up with a situation where the GM's talking sort of non-stop for a large portion of the session. And let's face it, as GMs, there's always a certain little bit of us that loves the sound of our own voice, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I certainly know I did it recently in a Numenera session of mine where I basically had an NPC sort of splurge a load of plot expo on them. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I was like, oh, I could have done that in like so many better ways than I've just done it. But which is part of the reason I think why I don't tend to have NPCs as leaders. I mean, I don't know, how do you guys go about sort of making sure that you don't sort of hog the spotlight too much as a GM almost if you were going to use an NPC as a leader? Because I think that temptation's always there.
I think the other John actually made a good point of you know, creating an NPC leader at your players' volition. You know, when you know, they're going to be leaders in the world, whether they're politicians or, you know, wizards in their towers. They're going to be leaders that are outside of the story even. And if you include them in the setting, you know, a leader that knows a lot about dragons, as another cliche example, then if your players know about that person, then when it comes to a time where they need to get some knowledge about, you know, this copper dragon on the other side of this ridge, they're going to think, hey, you know, this person knows about this type of creature, so let's go talk to them. You know, they're going to go to them for leadership instead of you as a GM saying, oh, by the way, you know this person, and they ham-fist all this knowledge down your throat, so now you know everything about dragons. You know, give them the opportunity to ask the questions of the NPC.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid approach. I mean, I'm trying to get into the idea with, to use your example of a sort of a knowledge check about dragons. I'm trying to get into an idea that someone put forward in the video. I can't quite remember whose video it was at the moment, but they're putting forward the idea of doing a knowledge check and then sort of having that lead into like a flashback or a segue that sort of explains how that knowledge check came about. And I don't think it's necessarily always easier to do, but it's certainly something I've been trying to do rather than just an NPC turns up and goes, yes, you want to know about dragons? Well, gather round and let me tell you the tale. Sort of thing.
Let me just speak for 30 minutes. I'm flattered that you watch my videos. Thanks.
I was just wondering if that was one of your videos. I've been doing that a lot lately as well. That's probably one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard on the YouTube channels.
I have found, thank you very much. I've found, though, that after a while, you know, if you keep doing every knowledge check as a flashback, then it becomes like, I'm just going to tell them it's a bear this time. You know, I'm just going to tell them, you know this about hobgoblins, instead of doing the 10th flashback or memory for the day.
Well, now you have 7 more ways, though, Barker.
Like decks, like the ones that sort of.
My video response.
Oh yeah.
You have more. There's more than one way to cook an egg. There's more than one way to do a knowledge check.
That's a perfectly connected example.
Yeah, I mean, I think aside from my my complete inability to remember whose videos I've been watching, for which I do apologise for, but one of the sort of casualties of trying to watch more YouTube videos to do like more video responses is I remember whose videos I've watched, but not which name goes with which video.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, I tend to when I can actually like run my YouTube, which obviously I can't at the minute because I've got this Hangout going. I tend to just have the sort of favourites list open so I can go, all right, who did that, and then quickly have a quick check of it.
Nice.
I do agree though, it's not something I'd use for every knowledge check, but certainly for like important ones or ones that are going to have great importance later on, because it builds up that investment, that sort of emotional connection that we were talking about earlier, which is so important in a role-play game if you want to actually get people to, well, give a damn about things, really.
Yeah, it's good as well if you start using them for decisions that or knowledge checks that can arrive from different ways, be it sort of experience or more book learning and stuff like that. And it gives you more options to bring stuff from the past and bite them in the arse, really, which is always good. One guy did a knowledge check, and it turned out sort of giving them choices to make, left, right, small ones. They ended up stealing something, and then later on bringing people looking for that object back, and it's like, I know who they are. I did do that, and then we're in trouble.
Knowledge checks are also good for leaving things open to interpretation to mess with people, especially in horror. Just describe something like an eldritch thing of tentacles or whatever, and it's just very ambiguous. It's completely open to interpretation. They torture themselves.
Well, it's that whole thing about whatever you can imagine is going to be far worse than anything that I can sort of describe to you, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
NPCs as knowledge beacons, I think, is a solid bit of advice. Kind of like not necessarily. Oh, you need to fight this dragon. Your cell phone rings, and it's this guy on the other line saying, "Hey, before you fight the dragon, you need to know." Blah blah blah. Instead, leave that a challenge maybe for your players to remember. Oh, that guy that the GM told us about, or that guy we met. Maybe if they're taking good notes, they'll remember.
On a side note to that, have you ever, when you got to that situation where there's a copper dragon across the ridge, there's that dragon guy, have you ever stopped when someone says, do I know about this dragon guy, and said, no, but you know someone who does know about this dragon guy, tell me about him, and let them sort of generate the leader that they go and see?
No, but that's an awesome idea. That is an excellent idea. Very cool. Like, where does he live? What does he look like? What's his race? What's his, what's his personality trait? That's awesome. I'm taking that, running with it.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say I made it up too.
I think one of the sort of cooler ideas that they push forward in the sort of like Powered by the Apocalypse / Dungeon World games is that whole idea of when you come up with your world, you leave blanks in your planning, and then you allow the players to sort of fill in those blanks with stuff that they've defined themselves, because obviously it's going to interest them to at least a degree, otherwise they wouldn't have suggested it in the first place.
See, Mike, you should have a YouTube channel. That was a great idea.
It's good to break the stereotype too. Of course, if it's going to be to dramatic and or narrative effect or comedic, but sometimes have them go to the leaders and the leaders be completely clueless. Again, just because he's the king doesn't mean that he knows about some farm that's on his land or that he cares about it. And I think having that, like, someone that's like completely knowledgeable, but like you come to them with the wrong answers, and just because they're an NPC doesn't mean they're going to be the mouthpiece for the GM. No, I don't think that means that, if you have 5 questions you need to ask, you got to go run down 5 different NPCs because one won't have all of them. But, I think that you should have, at least me, I'm a GM, if someone's like, all right, we're hungry, okay, so you go to the bakery. All right, well, whatever. They end up asking the baker about, again, the dragon or the orc army. You just scared the bejesus out of this guy. This guy's thinking about moving out of town. He knows nothing about what you're talking about. He's more ignorant about it than you are. Have those moments. And again, don't do it to frustrate your players, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, what might be even better is, maybe he does have information, but it's bad information. Maybe it's a town rumor. Oh, the wizard he shoots rainbows out of his butt, and when they hit you, you explode. And no, dude's just a hermit.
Yeah.
In those cases, it's always good though to have my favorite NPC, knowledge NPC, is one that will give your leaders, your player leaders, really weird information, but it's always right. Like the craziest news, the craziest info, and they're like, there's no way this can be true, but it's always true.
Yeah, that works really well in Vampire, because you have all these clans that have like future sight and all these sixth sense abilities, but they're vampires. They are, do you really want to trust them? And yeah, they're right every time, but like it's batshit crazy. And what if they're not right this time, and you get caught doing their dirty deed?
Well, as you're saying, I think if you have an NPC who's giving out this information as well, even if they do have all of the information, as an NPC, they're obviously going to have their own agendas, their own reasons behind doing whatever they do. So they may not be presenting you with all the information deliberately because it serves their agenda, or they may be trying to put a bit of a spin on the information. I think that could be a potentially another interesting way of having an NPC as a leader. If you've got an NPC with some sort of agenda, you could potentially have the players unraveling that agenda and then maybe deciding, well, do we still want to be following this guy when we know he's up to all of this sort of stuff behind the scenes? Maybe he's not got our best interests at heart after all. I think that could be potentially a very interesting plot line to pursue.
And that's another way of making leaders give players choices rather than not, is making them unreliable and making their biases apparent, because then the players have their own interpretation about whether or not they can go with what he says, right? Because it's not guaranteed anymore. So
yeah, that's another way of kind of putting the choice on the players themselves, and having them have the leader emerge.
I think it's nice as well if you have so when they do unravel whatever schemes that the NPC's been up to, or his sort of angle on whatever information that he's been giving them, that it's not one of those sort of black and white decision of, oh, he's been performing evil sacrifices to the elder gods behind our backs, we definitely shouldn't follow him as a leader. If it's a sort of more morally ambiguous thing that maybe even some of the player characters disapprove of, and some are like, well, to be honest, I can understand that. So, but I think you could run into a danger there of that effectively splitting a party. If some of them are like, well, yeah, we support what he's done, we can understand that, we'll still vote for him as the leader. And if some of them are like, oh no, I really don't feel comfortable following them after that. So if we were going to go with this example of having a sort of NPC who's maybe a little bit on the shadier side of the sort of morally ambiguous side, how would you guys go about avoiding that just sort of splitting the party and having the exact opposite result of having a leader in charge? Or would you even try and prevent that? Would you maybe just run with it?
I don't think I would. I'd be more than willing to do it. Like I said, one of the big things that happened in the game I'm running now was the party essentially splitting, and then two of the characters going at fists to try and kill each other. I think there's so much potential though when the party splits, and when you've got that morally grey, like you get so many good stories and so many good potentials. And I don't mind, depending on the group. The group I've got now are very good. They're players, but they're also observers in the audience, so they don't mind sitting in muting the mics for a few minutes as we do something with the group across the town. If it gets to the point where they are going to start fighting, I'll probably split the calls, take people into other rooms and stuff like that. A good point that I think as well is if DMs or people who are telling a story are afraid of splitting the party, you wouldn't have things like Frodo and Aragorn and the two different separate groups going their own ways. But you also wouldn't have stuff like the Marvel Civil War, which is a really good storyline. And I think none of the parties involved were wrong, but they were opposed. And I think getting that in an RPG, if you can do something like that, and it's done and handled fairly for both sides, you can really create something very memorable.
I think it's important to give your players a stake in kind of the mission, especially, I agree with Mike totally that splitting the party is such an awesome opportunity. My main group, though, is an around-the-table group, and that can, if you're in a live game, not Google Hangouts where you can just split the time and schedule 2 games. I live out in the middle of nowhere, and people have to drive out to come to the game. So, and I don't want half the table, on their cell phones or whatever, just doing nothing or being bored. At that point, I would ask, this character that's not interested in following this person, in this example, maybe the person is shady or they don't like him. I think about, what does that character want? Does that character want money? Does that character want friendship, love, loyalty, power? And find some way to, to show them that carrot, that dangling carrot of, they can actually get this if they, go along with the party. If I do that far too often, though, then I am almost undoubtedly, railroading these players into a certain, or maybe not railroading, but what's the word for like a choke point, like funneling them into this one. Yeah. Play. Yeah, exactly.
I believe a better term is herding.
Meta
manipulation sounds like a really bad psychological thing.
Yeah. And like I said, if you really need to, if you're strapped for ideas, and the leader is not doing a very good job at bringing the party together, or maybe there is no leader, this might be the kind of nudge that is necessary. But if you do that, every single game session, it's going to get old.
Mm. What about using other forms of media to sort that out, like speak to them and go, I understand you don't want to be involved, with the guy who's digging up corpses and making an army to defend his country, and sort of either, I guess, getting them involved in the story as a side character, or asking them to go along with it, and then going to something like a play-by-post and working out something along there with them. Have you ever tried anything like that?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent idea. One of my characters right now is the leader of a city in my live group, kind of the duke, if you will, and the other players aren't. They're powerful people, but they don't lead the city. And part of that development in his character, part of what this player wants to do is make decisions of what this city will do, how the infrastructure will be. He wants to actually be a leader of this place, and I don't want to do that at the table while everyone else is sitting there. So we basically just do that in phone conversations, and like you said, play by post. I feel like this might happen. Okay, well then I would do this. And that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that can work very well. I mean, even if, as you say in Barker, you've got people who drive out, you don't want them to be sat around in a session not really doing anything. Even if you do something like you have them playing a side character in the one game, and then you have the other few people playing side characters when you do the next session, which is based on the other character, that can work well depending on what the plot is and how easy it is to split them out. Because obviously if you've got one guy who's effectively, his plot involves him sort of sat around in a room in a castle writing letters for 3 months, whereas the other players are off doing something exciting and interesting, then you're probably not going to have quite such an even split in the sessions. But certainly splitting the sessions and having people running side characters can work very well. It's certainly something I've used in the past as well.
All very good ideas that I, again, am going to steal and take credit for.
Well, I'm all in favour of GMs stealing things. I think, if I remember correctly, I did a video at one point called "Steal Everything." So,
yep, you did.
That was a great video.
I definitely can't complain about that. I mean, I'm sure when some of you log out from this hangout, you'll probably notice there's a few chairs missing from your rooms, and that's because I've had them.
You've given me all these weird images in my head of you, John, just peering up behind people while we're on the hangout. Where did John go? When you had to go on your phone for a minute and your screen went blank. I was checking the other John's screen just to see if your face would pop up behind his shoulder. That would be hilarious.
You've no idea how much I'd love it if I could sort of move over to the side of my frame and then actually start appearing in the frame, the film strip at the bottom. If it was within my technological power to make that happen, I would do that in a second.
I think at that point we'd be playing Call of Cthulhu.
That would be the best trick ever for a Call of Cthulhu campaign. Like online, just the ability to mess with other people's camera feeds, so you just put things in the background. That would be amazing.
Playing with someone who you've worked out with their significant other, that when you start to reach your hand over like that, they sneak up behind them off camera and just start putting their hands closer to their head.
It'd be better for Cthulhu if you could sort of go like that, and then sort of like an inflatable like tentacle or something similar like came in on the other.
It's like the Slender Man of Google Hangouts.
Oh, that'd be even better if you could arrange like 4 people to do it. So you had just like an arm stretching across like 4 different frames at the bottom.
Have you ever done that sort of like? What was that, Mike?
I was gonna say, if someone goes AFK to go to the toilet or something like that, you all agree to basically just stand up and just move off frame and don't say anything.
Have any of you ever done that sort of kind of meta event? One time I was running kind of a horror game. It was an episode in the long running campaign that was supposed to be more scary than other episodes, because it was near Halloween, and I kind of sent a text message to my wife, to really loudly bang on the wall in the room that we were in, at a certain time, and they all just got completely freaked out. It was the perfect effect. But have any of you ever done something like that?
Not so much on sort of tabletop or Google Hangouts. I did go to a live action roleplay event once where we effectively had to, for part of the event, there was like a sort of tunnel system, also artificial and all perfectly safe, made out of the sort of like the poly plastic tunnels you get, and we had to crawl through them, and they just had secreted around the outside a number of guys with like sticks effectively, and they just sort of ran these sticks along the sort of corrugated edge of these tunnels, which sort of inside it just sounded like there were things coming out of like the darkness around you and sort of behind you, which, for saying it was just basically 3 guys running sticks along the top of it, sort of, well, to be honest, I about shit myself, so.
That's very cool. Oh yeah, so player leaders.
Okay.
Well, player leaders are the people that you would have as your incognito inside the party guy to organize things like that with.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's another use for party leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to a bit how much of a working relationship, not necessarily a friendship, as you say, they have with the GM. So as John was saying, can the GM sort of feed back to them and vice versa? So I think we, as GMs, I mean, I know certainly myself, I'm always asking for feedback from my players about how the session's gone. Since obviously we all want to sort of improve and run the best games we can, and one of the best ways to do that is to get feedback from your players as to how you're running it at the moment. But in terms of, if you have a player party leader there, you can potentially feed back to them as well on how the party is working within the game and any potential sort of sticking points there might be. I don't know if anyone else has tried that sort of having that player guy you sort of feed back to as a GM.
Have you guys ever had a character emerge as a leader that is kind of inappropriate to be a leader? My example would be in a Changeling game that I was playing in. I had this character, and essentially the thing about the character was he was old. He was really, really old, and one of the classes in Changeling are the Wizened, and they're sort of like small, really small, and kind of hobbled over and petite, and they all look older than they really are. But I just ran with it. Like I spoke in a voice that sounded like it was someone that was like far, like they should have died 20 years ago. And then people just constantly were like, "How are you so old?" and all this, and it was great role playing. It was pretty much comedic relief because I'm used to GMing. So when I play, I usually want to do a support character. I don't want a whole lot of responsibility. I just want to have fun. But partly probably because they know, they had played underneath. They had been used to playing underneath me, and partly because this character had so many great scenes and was really funny, and I just constantly was in character and constantly probably spotlight hogging and, to be honest, encroaching on other people's time. But then, so it was partly my own fault. But when the time came to make any sort of decision, whether it be an actual decision or just where are we going to go next, a lot of people would, out of character turn to me, and I would be like, do you really want... My character's name was Codger. I was like, do you really want Codger to make the decision? Like, if you do, I will, but realize that's not what I created this character for. I mean, he's not really sane at all in the traditional sense.
Yeah, I've been in similar situations where, like, because I tend to play characters who aren't necessarily the sort of leader type characters for exactly the same reason. I spend a lot of time GMing, where you're effectively presenting the roleplay world to the characters. So when I'm actually enjoying someone else's world that they've created, I almost want to sort of take a step backwards, and I'm happy to support other players and sort of shine the spotlight around as much as possible, but I don't want to sort of be in the spotlight all the time myself. So I've played like ridiculous, like, half-orc barbarians, where they are the sort of standard, like, half-orc, where every problem is to, like, crush it beneath your fists and sort of drive your enemies before you, sort of Conan styling. And you get to situations where people all, because they know you naturally as a GM or as someone who can take a leadership role, even though you're playing some sort of mono-browed half-orc thug, they'll still turn to you and sort of look at you and sort of expect you to make the decisions. And you're sort of like, really? You're expecting my character to say anything other than, yes, let's ride out and kill it.
That's a good advice, though. You know,
if they started playing and they had the monobrow look head and they were like, so what do we do now? And you just kill stuff. And then just ask the DM where the nearest goblin tribe is, and then just take them there and hunt and destroy.
And maybe that's why you guys have so many burned towns.
Well, I can't claim entirely responsibility for that, because, again, I don't play a leadership role in that game either. So,
I think far more often I've had players emerge as someone that's like, ooh, really? He's going to be the leader? Ouch. Instead of characters, like actual people. And I think that's far more difficult because, I can kill their character. I can't really kill them. Well, no matter how much I want.
Sage piece of advice for all role players out there: kill the characters, not the players.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah. Player.
Well, they do call it a TPK, not a TCK. So.
Good point. I'm now imagining a sort of game setup with, like, trapdoors underneath the players, like chairs, and a sort of big red button next to the games master station.
It reminds me of that really old comic, the black and white comics for the controversial one a while ago, where it's like, no black light, you can't be dead. No, you never see that character again in the comic.
What's the scene in the first Batman with Jack Nicholson as the Joker, where they're all sitting around a table and then someone says the wrong thing, I can't really remember, but then gets, dipped into acid and just comes back up as a skeleton? I need to order one of those acid pits.
Check for traps.
Yeah, I do think it can be difficult when you've got a player who's maybe not suitable for a leadership role, or who's putting themselves forward, rather than a character. Because, as you say, people can play different characters, they can sort of change their personas, whereas realistically we've all got characteristics as players, as GMs, that are sort of like hardwired into us, that it's more difficult to sort of smooth over or maybe not represent. I'm sure we all have certain sort of similarities within our characters when we play them. Try as we might play different things, there's always certain things that I tend to find are similar between characters played by the same people, myself included. So I think that would be more difficult. I don't know how you guys would go about handling a player who maybe you think, is this going to be good for the game if they're the leader, or would you just let the dice fall where they may and run with whatever happens, whatever aftermath occurs in the game, and pick up the pieces later?
I think, just in my personal experience, the people that emerge as leaders that I don't want them to really emerge as the leaders, the worst case scenario is that they're the genre changers. You go in for horror, you go in for serious, low fantasy maybe, and then everything becomes Monty Python because that person's the leader, that person is the one speaking, and if they play that same person every single game, that you can run into a problem. The only time any of my games have ever ended in fire, I've had a lot end in ice, just frozen and just die, but the only time one has ever ended in fire, it's because of this exact thing that we're talking about. Wrong person being a leader or a conflict in leadership roles.
Yeah, and I think as a leader of a party anyway, you need to have a certain sort of thickness of skin when it comes to sort of taking criticisms and feedback off people, because you're never going to make everyone happy 100% of the time with whatever decisions you make, no matter how well intentioned. So I mean, one of the problems I've certainly found is when you get people going to be a leader, and you know that the player is maybe not as receptive to sort of feedback or criticisms as maybe some other people. Because if you get someone who's receptive to feedback, you can be constructive. You can say, oh, well, maybe this would have worked better or that would have worked better. If, however, a person's first response when you give them feedback is to sort of shy away from that, or is even worse, sort of hostile towards the idea of having feedback or constructive criticism, I think that can be very difficult and very detrimental to a game.
That's where you get the, well, that's what my character would do response.
Oh, no.
I know. I know, exactly.
And that's when you respond in character. What are you talking about with characters? What is this character which you spit? This isn't a play. What do you think this is? This is life.
That's when I reach for the button into the acid pit.
Yes, that's what.
Stand still because I need your ribcage for a phylactery.
I think there are some situations where the response, oh, well, it's what my character would do, in all seriousness, are justified. But yeah, I think unfortunately it's been used as an excuse for sort of disruptive or sort of bad behaviour so often that it's almost sort of lost any meaning where someone says that it's just that sort of like flippant phrase now.
Should just bring back to the point that one of the leaders that is always defined in a majority of role-playing games, not all of them, is the GM himself and their personality when they're leading the game, because you can have in-character and out-of-character party leaders, but essentially if you've got a strong leader in the DM himself, then they can sort of maybe rein in or herd the group in how they handle problem players or problem situations in a diplomatic way, or whether they do get defensive and then other people get defensive and then an argument kicks off. So I think a good DM leader will be able to handle situations a little better than someone who likes the idea of DMing and all fairness for them, give it a go. But if they don't have that strong personality, it can sometimes be overshadowed by other players that do have that stronger personality and that come out as more of leaders. In which case, I say just give them a shot at DMing, because some of the more demanding players can usually make good DMs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the main things about being a GM is sort of knowing when to pick your battles. Almost is one of the useful characteristics, because there's certain times when you have to be diplomatic and you sort of have to sort of find a middle road through a number of options, and then there's other times when you have to sort of put your foot down and say, well, no, I'm taking a stand on this, and this is how it is. And you hear stories of sort of GMs who've been sort of put off by players who are constantly trying to overrun their decisions or sort of second guess them, and they don't really seem to be willing to sort of say, well, no, this is how it is. If you've got any issues, we can deal with that at a later date. We're going to move on with the game. And I've certainly known a number of game sessions that have ground to a halt because the GM was maybe not a strong enough character to sort of make a stand where it was necessary. But by the same token, you can't also have a GM who's entirely unresponsive to any sort of criticism or feedback from the players. I think that'd be just as bad almost.
Those are the kinds of players or kinds of leaders where being subversive style GMing is actually the most helpful, because there are ways you can actually steer them in the right direction or actually switch leadership to someone else through a few subtle ways, like if using ambiguity to know what their expectations are, and then using that to create situations where their character is pretty much useless and someone else gets to take over as the leader. There's ways there's workarounds as well to do that if diplomacy isn't an option.
I mentioned earlier that game that ended in fire, and it reminds me of something that's worse than not having a leader in a party, and worse than having, I think, the wrong leader in the party in a lot of ways. But is that I did the iconic running two campaigns in the same world type of scenario, and of course when you do that, you think, oh man, you know what we should do? We should get together and play one game where the parties meet, and the table will be full, and they'll do the same mission, and then we'll go back to the normal days. And I decided to do that, and that's how basically the campaign burnt to a crisp, is by taking one party who had their really solid, great party leader, and taking another party who had a really great, solid, forward, progressive party leader, and putting them together, and then watching them just take sides and fight the entire time over who got to be the party leader.
Well,
having too many strong personalities.
What to highlight of that, because I haven't, I've run World of Darkness and D&D, Pathfinder stuff. I haven't been DMing long enough to try something like that. I think what might be cool is if that's the natural response when you put two parties with two leaders together for a game, is instead of putting them together and go, right, this is your mission, do it more like the American Civil War, the Marvel Civil War, where it's two sides, something like there's a moral grey ground, but characters from that can basically sit on any side of the table. So you're sort of backing a cause as opposed to a person, and it could be kind of cool how what the fallout of that would be when they do go back to their normal lives, when they're like, we're friends in this game, in this line, the narrative line. But yet, when that happens, you're fighting against each other because of the moral greys and the differences that you have in your opinions and stuff that's going on. I think that would be a cool way to handle it. And then just play it more like a PvP, like a down-the-middle PvP kind of game. And, watch everybody die, probably.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, and 90% of it, I think I place the fault on myself for not prepping, not being open-minded, not even considering this as a problem. The other 10%, I mentioned that guy that's no longer in our gaming group, because instead of doing that, diverting that energy against the other players, and maybe growing the plot a little bit, they were interrogating this one prisoner of theirs, and he just stabbed him and killed him and walked away. And so he didn't take out that energy on the other players. He took it out on the story itself, which is, that's a huge player problem, obviously. But yeah, if I could go back, I would have done so many things differently. I would have prepped it differently. The storyline would have been different. I put a vast majority of that fault on myself.
I will take that as feedback, and when I come to do it.
Yeah, I think the only way I've found one of the ways I've found to bring two groups together and then to have them, as you say, not just fight against each other and sort of spend all their time sort of duking it out between each other, is to have a third party that they either hate or dislike even more than each other. But you have to sort of set that up well in advance so they actually do really hate that person. If you just drop a villain in and sort of say, oh, well, your adventure as your powers combine, as your two parties come together, is to fight against this evil dragon, and there's been no mention of this evil dragon before, only a sort of tangential mention of him, they'll just be like, oh yeah, that's very interesting, now let's get back to setting each other on fire and dealing with our own inter-party issues.
Yep. That was the biggest problem I did. Biggest mistake I made was putting the two parties together and having the first thing they do be kind of an encounter involving making a decision. Because they're like, that's what led to the argument is, oh, I make the decisions in this group. Well, now there's this new person here, and the biggest problem is when the in-character drama seeps out onto the table, and then people around the table start forming the out-of-character drama. That's when you know you've done it wrong. You've done goofed.
Oh, there's a point to be said about if you're a leader and you're unwilling to let go of that role, you probably shouldn't have been in that role in the first place. That's not a constructive party leader if you even have one. I think it's better to have no leader in that situation, in all honesty.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Is it better to have no leader at all than it is to have for argument's sake, what we might call a bad leader in charge of a party? I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, I think that's what Mike said. That's when it comes down to the GM.
Yeah, I think if you imagine a group and you've got that slot for leadership, if you put a bad player in it, other players will probably be less likely to either vie for the leadership, both in and out of character, because they'll see it as a taken up slot. Whereas if you have no leader, I think it's just natural human evolution to fill that no leader slot, to put someone there or something, and eventually it will grow organically. And if it develops naturally, then the person that ends up in that spot is going to be the best choice. We would have earned it, as opposed to sort of talking to the DM beforehand and saying, you can be the leader of this party. Earning the leadership thing, keeping the slot open for maybe a couple of sessions if it's a new campaign or something, and then seeing who slots into it nicely is probably a lot better. So no leader is probably better than a bad leader, because I think eventually it'll be filled.
I've always thought no leader is better than a bad leader, because a bad leader can ruin a campaign, whereas just a bad non-leader can be overshadowed by the other players.
Well, and in my opinion, a good leader should give the support. You should have the support, but ultimately, in a sense, you should feel like there is no leader, because they should be supportive of everyone else, unless it is something like a military, where everyone's a platoon, where you specifically have the same goals. A good leader should facilitate in and out of game, just like a good GM. You facilitate, you enable people to do what they want to do. You throw more stuff, you pitch them more balls that they can hit out of the park, and they give you balls to throw at them that that they want to hit out of the park.
I'm glad you brought up that term facilitate. To facilitate a discussion is to know where the discussion is going to end, or at least have an idea of where it might end, and then make it appear as if the players themselves or the people that you're talking to about whatever make it appear as if they came up with the plot themselves. Kind of that illusion, just to peek behind the barbed curtain of the DM screen, if you will. That's a very, I think, an awesome skill to have as a DM, is the ability to facilitate.
Totally. Well, how would you guys do this? This is a little bit different than actually, I suppose, pertaining to a leader, but I guess maybe it does. But how would you, as a group or as a leader in game, how would you deal with characters like the Justice League, Batman, who when the U.S. government shuts him down or something's happening, Batman just decides, I'm not gonna, I don't agree with this, and he just turns off the intercom, and they're like, well, that's that. If anyone else in the Justice League, Superman included, did that, we would, something would be wrong and we would investigate. But Batman's Batman, what are we gonna do? And I suppose the easiest answer is, well, Batman's not a good, role-playing character. Don't create someone that's that much of a lone wolf. But, I do think that it's doable, but it would be challenging. What do you guys think about that, about sort of those, I suppose, for lack of a better term, those rogue characters in the group, the true rogues,
The anti-leader.
Yeah,
non-leader.
Probably find their motivator as a character and use that against them to get them on board. Might be a good way of doing it.
Stealing Batman's girlfriend usually helps.
Well, yeah, and there's a difference between people that just don't care about the plot, so they decide to derail it or not invest, or people who have genuine qualms about what's going on. Like if one PC is assaulting an NPC and another PC is disturbed by that, he may try to stop the other player character. And that may be annoying, or it may not be, but if that's in line with what the character does, then great,
I think that's
what you feel your character would do.
I think that's something where I'd probably rely on the, as we've said before, on the actual sort of established ties between the characters. I mean, to use your example of Batman, there's obviously connections that mean that he stays in the Justice League and doesn't just sack the whole thing off and go on to do his own thing. So I think if someone came to me and said, "Oh, I want this character who's you know, the stereotypical person who goes, "Oh, I want a character who's a bit of a loner. I wander through the night with nothing but my trusty long trench coat and my katana after my parents were killed in a horrible accident that destroyed all of my relatives and connection." We all know the sort of like the lone wolf character I'm talking about. I'd say to the person, I think you can play that trench coat McNinja sword character. That's absolutely fine. I've no problem with that at all. But you've got to actually have a reason to want to be in the game. If someone creates a character that's got no reason to be in the game, like at the drop of the hat, they can just go, "Oh, that's it. My character's out of this," and goes off entirely to do something else. Then I'd seriously question at the start, well, why do you actually want to play this character? Because you must be aware that as a GM, I'm not going to run an entirely separate game just for your one PC. So the amount of time you'll be getting in the spotlight, to use that term again, will be minimal, because the rest of the time I'm going to be dealing with the rest of the player characters. And it's that whole thing I've mentioned before, where if you've got 4 players in a game and they all split off and do their own thing, they're effectively, if you split it equally, they're getting 25% of the time that you've got allotted for role-playing. Whereas if they're all together as a group and they're all sort of enabling the role play for each other, effectively they can all be involved in 100% of the role playing time. Obviously not to the same extent, because everyone has a little bit of time in the spotlight, but they can all actually be involved in it rather than just going, "Oh, well, that's my little scene done. Right, I've got to wait another hour before the spotlight swings back around to me again." So I definitely want the Batman player to come up with some solid reasons why his character would keep getting drawn back into the game before I sort of rubber stamp approved that character.
I think that's more of a thing with probably a problem players more than anything. I mean, creating those lone wolf characters is cool and everything, and they come up with a legitimate justification to go with the group, then by all means go crazy. It can work. But if you speak to them and they say, "Well, no, he's just a lone wolf character," I'd say, "Well, it's a great character concept, and I can see it's got a lot of potential, but it just wouldn't work in the game. Please revise it in a way that it could. Maybe put him on the back burner for like another campaign we might run, and rework him so that he does have more of a motivation to work with the group." I think if you handled it, most people would be okay with that. Like, they'd say, "Okay, I understand what you mean." If at that point they got defensive and problematic, going, "Why are you ruining my fun?" and all that sort of stuff, it would literally be a case of a problem player, and then you address it differently, really.
I mean, I think it's a difference between a player who appreciates the fact that a role-play game is a group activity, but who wants to play like a lone wolf character to explore whatever stories they want to tell with that, as opposed to someone who wants to be, as a player, wants to be that sort of like lone wolf style person. It's very difficult if someone's like not taking a great deal of interest in it as a group activity to get them to see that sort of group side of it. But again, I'd sort of question, well, if you're not really into the whole sort of group activity, is an RPG the best forum for your entertainment?
You nailed it, man.
To be honest,
conversation.
Yeah, just to try and sort of put it diplomatically, everyone should know that a role-play game is a group activity. That's why the other people are there, after all.
So just ambiance.
That's it. They're not just sort of like background music and mood lighting for
your
an
audience.
Game.
Yeah, they're
Your
my
audience. Oh goodness.
But I think if you're a player who appreciates the fact that it is a group activity, but you want to tell some compelling stories with a sort of loner style character, as John was saying, that can work really well, and there's ways around that sort of thing. So I think that's more of a problem with the player, as Mike was saying, rather than the actual sort of character type specifically.
It comes back to what was being mentioned earlier about Darth Vader, and how people are genuinely interested in characters that have this massive arc. I don't know if anyone watches Walking Dead, but Carol is another good character. She's a very timid housewife, and she turns into this amazing, zombie apocalypse survivor. If they came to me and said, "I want to create this lone wolf," and yes, at the start, I want to play him where he's very much, he's the type of guy who would just ignore the team tactic, and go for what he thinks is best, but I want to kind of work it in where he does start to develop friendships and begrudgingly gets close to these people. I'd be all for that, because that's amazing. And if they can pull it off right, and even if the other people don't know about it, the first time he does something that sacrifices what he wants to do and focuses on what the group's meant to be doing, he'll feel good because he got what he wants. And the rest of the group would be, they'd probably start buzzing off it because they'd start to see the character development. And at the end of the day, character development is what's at the core of all narrative.
So, do any of you have any problems running a game? Actually, Chepe, you go first. Then I'll ask the question.
I was gonna say, back in my free roam role playing games where you experience the best and worst that players have to offer, in the wonderful days of forums and chat rooms, there's a trick that you can use to make it so that lone wolf characters were always involved in group tactics in a way and still be lone wolf characters. They work very well with the specialists, so like your net runners in Shadowrun, or clerics that only are there to heal and cast undead, that kind of thing. Like character roles that are very specific for that situation, but they're the man in that situation, are very good for the lone wolf kinds of characters or people who want to play lone wolf characters. So you can suggest that. That way they can just set aside and just do what they want in the party until their time to shine has come, and then they do the lone wolf thing. The other, I guess, the golden rule for these kinds of things is if, like, for the same way with the leader, for the same way, the same rule also applies to the lone wolf character. If what you're doing is interesting for the story, then do it. If not, then don't. Sorry, Barker.
No, not at all. That's excellent advice. I mean, that's an excellent point you have, and that actually kind of leads into what I was going to ask: is, are any of you avidly against running a game for one person? Because it's something I've done in the past, and honestly, some of the best games we've run were just one-on-one games, one GM, one player, telling a story, and some people don't enjoy that. Some GMs never run that, and some players, but some players really like it. So, I mean, if that is the type of character that someone wants to play, that lone wolf, I think that's even the title of the type of game. A lone wolf game is, just one player. Are any of you against doing that? And have any of you done that successfully or unsuccessfully?
I've started running a 5th edition game now with 3 people. And we've had, I think, 2 sessions, but those 2 sessions have been split between the 3 people at different times. So essentially, for the first, I'm not a fan of sort of either dumping people in taverns and saying, you meet here, or getting them to tell us what the backstory is and how they met. I prefer to play through it. So I kind of like the idea of doing the one-on-one sessions with 3 people sort of parallel, and then seeing how they can work, work the stories in together to eventually get to a point where they become a party. And I think it makes people attached to their characters and realize that they are individuals that are a part of a group as opposed to a group entity. And it's a lot of fun as well because you work through the backstory. My girlfriend is also a big player as well, and I've kind of been hoping to do for a while sort of like a one-on-one campaign, lone wolf campaign thing. There's some I really like the idea of doing, because you can literally tailor the game to anything they want, and you have no problem with what people want to do in that gaming time. It's always one character, really, one person, one world.
I was going to say, in terms of the background that you want to play through, have you considered having your players make some kind of check and then playing it out as a flashback? I seem to remember someone did a video on it at some point. I can't quite remember who, but
for a second I thought my feed was repeating, where I was like, wait, what? I thought we've already been here. There goes John again, messing with the metaverse.
That's it. I mean, I think I'm not particularly opposed to running a session for one person. I've not I have to admit I've not actually ran a sort of one-on-one session just because that's not come up as an opportunity. The sort of lowest number of people I've had in a group has been 2, I believe, up until present. I'm not opposed to it. I do think, though, that one of the benefits of having more people is you obviously got more people there to bounce ideas off and more sort of ideas to put into a campaign, whereas if you've only got yourself and one other person, you've obviously only got 2 viewpoints. I can't claim to know how directly that would affect it, since, as I say, I've never run a one-on-one game.
I could.
Yeah, I've never done it either. But if I did do it, I would want to do it with, or if I was running it, I would want it to be probably another GM, unless I was, unless there was without a doubt in my mind that this is a badass player. I would probably want it to be a GM. Even if they, only GM'd 1 campaign ever or 4 sessions ever, just from, being on the other side and knowing what it's like John said, it's asking a lot, of someone for just 2 people to sit there, and it's definitely doable, but you got to make sure that they're ready to be that backboard to bounce each and every idea off of.
I've actually done this a lot. Because there's very few people that are willing to play my games in person. So when you get a game in, you get a game in. But especially with my free-form role-playing days, I've done quite a bit of that. I've done a lot of play-by-post, chat room, and even in person that way with one person. And you're right. It has to be someone who bounce things personally and could bounce things off with. Otherwise, it won't work. But what I did notice as a cool trick for that particular format, it's the best format to have a genre or a story that is a series of conversations.
What do you mean?
And so, for example, I did one where we were essentially 2 Native American mages from, I can't remember what the tribe was. Crap, I'm gonna have to Wikipedia that later. But it was the inner politics between us manipulating a tribe, and so it was the back and forth conversations between these mages about what was going on between the tribes. Or another scenario might be a teacher and a student and their progression going, and so it's basically their Obi-Wan and Luke kind of scenarios, just each one. And so that's actually the best format I could think of, where it's a continuous series of conversations, like a president or someone volunteering for office and them going through the process of campaigning, if you wanted to do a story session like that.
A defense attorney in a prosecution in a courtroom.
Yes, very much so, because you're one-on-one, it's personal, right? There's no one else to intrude on the conversation, and it doesn't do that. So this is actually the best format to have those little subset kinds of stories where all those conversations can take place. And it's actually really engaging that way. So if it's getting boring really quickly, just start conversation in character and then start framing scenes around those conversations.
Fiasco is a good game that models off that. It's a brilliant game, and it works well with that sort of stuff. And not so much of a segue, but Fiasco is also one of those games that has no definable leader in it, either as the characters or the people themselves. Like, there's no DM or anything like that. So I mean that works really well, I think.
It occurs to me that we've talked about NPCs, sort of like a singular like NPC as a leader. Has anyone run games where they've had sort of organisations or sort of larger groups as a leader rather than an individual NPC?
I was thinking about that earlier, and I haven't ran anything like that. Not that I can think of, but I was thinking earlier that again, for certain genres, certain things, certain tropes work well, and I think that if you were going to do like an X-Files style game, that you have that shadow organization that you work for, or or even Stalker. I don't own the book. I've tried to get it, but anyway, long story short, I get the impression that's the same way in Stalker or a lot of sci-fi games is that you work for an organization, or maybe you're loosely affiliated with it, and you're doing these things, but you don't really know what you're doing, who you're doing it for, or what the ultimate outcome of this is going to be. And that, that loss of control and that ambiguity and vagueness is bad for a lot of games. Like dungeon crawling, it's simple. You just need to know what's up. In most genres, you need more. The more information, the better. But sometimes to have that faceless organization, that of course you have the one face to it. You have the guy that comes and you have your clandestine, just like in the X-Files, you have your clandestine meetings with another agent until eventually he winds up dead, who leaks you the information, or if you're playing in that kind of a game where you're sort of the unwitting pawns of like someone said earlier, I think it was you, John, about unraveling this great scheme. But if this scheme's greater than just one person or even a country, if it spans, if it's like an Illuminati sort of a thing, that's what springs to my mind. And I haven't ran something like that, but I would in a heartbeat.
Basically, what you described is pretty much every cyberpunk game in all of existence. Right? So Cyberpunk is perfect for you. Just grab a Cyberpunk game. It doesn't matter which, and it's going to end up being that or involving that in some form or fashion. Although Stalker actually isn't that way, if that's what you're looking for, by the way.
Well,
Stalker
the thing
is
is,
not really a shadow organization.
I'm interested in Cyberpunk. The thing is, I just bought Shadowrun, so they're similar enough for me, and role-playing books cost so much that for now, I think that'll do my fix on that. But yeah, totally.
Shadowrun
is
is
Shadowrun Cyberpunk sort of a thing.
Shadowrun is Cyberpunk. It is
Totally.
It's about as Cyberpunk as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much just Cyberpunk with a few sort of cross-pollinated elements from the fantasy genres. It's certainly how I've seen it.
You've not really lived until you've rolled 2 handfuls of D6s at once.
Pretty much.
Hey, well, I grew up with World of Darkness, so I'm used to all that nonsense.
Yeah, I pretty much grew up with the here's a big bucket I'm going to fill with D10s and empty it onto the table sort of system as well.
Nice.
Nothing's as bad as Scion or Exalted, though, that I've found. Those are both.
Exalted 2nd Edition is the most abominable thing.
Yeah.
And my 2 options for playing is the WoW-like Pathfinder player groups, and then the Exalted 2nd Edition swears by and plays almost nothing else groups, except other World of Darkness games that they also min-max. I'm sitting here wallowing.
It's probably one of the Exalted Second is probably one of the few games where I've thought that I could have done with like an extra sort of little scroll that sort of pops out and rolls down when I open my character sheet just to write all the rules for the power, all the various different dice combinations on. Because I love the idea of a sort of Magitech sort of manga, semi sort of manga style, futuristic sort of idea that sort of harkens back to a mythic past, and it's all sort of wuxia style and sort of very high fantasy. And then when you sit down, you go, all right, so I'm rolling 35 dice for this attack, and unless he's got a perfect defense, in which case I've got to roll this slightly different combination, and then I've got this merit that gives me an extra 2 dice, and if I'm using them in conjunction with my circle mate, that gives me an anima bonus of 3 dice.
And with the 35 dice you're rolling, that +2 is really something, huh? You feel...
That's it, yeah. You can sort of hear the sound of like your own beard growing as you're sort of calculating the dice.
It would be horrific.
It's horrible.
Beard growing. It sounds horrific.
A 2nd level spell destroys an entire army, right? And sorcery is considered underpowered.
Yeah. Although my personal favourite spell has to be the one where you sort of throw out your hand and basically like a sort of whirlwind death blade thing, so like a circular saw blade comes out and you can pretty much just point it at anyone and go, whoop, you're dead, and just like chop the head off in a one shot and be like, oh well, that's that person dealt with.
But you have to go through 8 rules in order to get there, though.
See, are you with the I'm just happy I've got a silver knife against a werewolf.
Just constant avalanches of die.
Although I must say, just to be like the voice of balance, I do love all the background in that game, and I'm hopeful that the new edition, the third edition they're doing, is going to iron out a lot of those problems and sort of make it a more playable system.
One of my dream characters is for Exalted, and I haven't found an adaptation into another setting yet.
So. I want to run a I'll be the head and you be the torso campaign using the Dragon-Blooded Exalted.
Oh, right, yeah.
So, you know, everyone's a different element, but it's just super cheesy, just for a not even a campaign, just a one-shot, you know. Earth, wind, fire, and, you know, you just do whatever.
Heart.
I've always thought Exalted the Power Rangers was a supplement they missed out on.
Well, they have that in one of the books as an alternative style of play. And then as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, that'd be perfect for the Dragon-Blooded.
You could just do Feng Shui. Just run that game. That game does that with a lot less hassle.
Yeah.
You want to kill someone? Is he named? No. Then he's open for insta-death. I love that rule. That's the best rule.
Yeah, when I ran Exalted, I just ran it like World of Darkness. I was like, yeah, this is gonna do. I'm not gonna.
I've got to admit, I do love Feng Shui, because any game where I can pick up and go, oh, I'm playing a cybernetically altered demon from 1200 AD who originally began life as a chicken and then got transformed by a wizard.
You can do that in this game. Made the RPG. And she could be a maid, a butler, anything you want.
There's got to be like a 4chan rule for that. If it exists, there's an RPG of it.
Yep. No.
I thought that was going to go elsewhere.
There's so many genres that are still unmade. I've tried.
Do a crossover of that made and Call of Cthulhu. That'll end well.
Unless you count Darwinia, there's not a good biopunk game.
Biopunk. I love that. I love all the genres, or all the, you know, with all the prefixes and then the suffix is just punk.
Yeah,
right. We're gonna
what
bring
is
some.
biopunk?
And when I say it, I don't necessarily mean punk at all. I mean something very specific from a literary genre. But
yeah.
Punk.
I do think a lot of these genres sound like someone's basically had like a 2-part random table and then just like rolled a couple of dice and they're like, oh, splatter, cyber espionage. Oh yeah.
Punk.
There's splatterpunk. There is splatterpunk, by the way. Just clarifying this. Splatterpunk's a thing. Rune punk is a thing. Diesel punk. There's
Lasagna punk.
So many punks.
What about hero?
Lasagna punk? There should be.
What about hero punk? Like the really gritty superheroes, like the old Heroes TV shows. Hero punk.
It's basically just the genre, the prefix genre, with a leather jacket and a pack of Lucky Strikes wrapped up in your sleeve.
At least 50% of the characters have to smoke.
Yeah. That's it.
It's whatever genre it is, but with more piercings.
Yes.
Piercings,
And that's
dyed
not
hair.
what I mean when I say steampunk. When I say steampunk, I'm actually thinking Victoriana, but some people actually think that.
No. Is that Victoriana or Victoriana punk?
Victoriana. Oh god.
I do think, just to sort of like bring it round again, that's one of the things where it's a difference between the sort of like the conception and the actual sort of reality of things, which sort of bring it back round to the idea of group leaders again. There's often a lot of people I've found who have sort of put themselves forward for the sort of like the group leader role, expecting it to be one thing, and then actually finding in reality when they actually get into it, it's maybe not as enjoyable or not what they thought it would be. And some people do great at that. They run with that and they find that they actually enjoy it more once they've actually got into it. In terms of people who maybe jump in without fully understanding the role of like a party leader is going to be in a game, how would you guys handle that as a GM if you've got someone who was really up for it at the start, but they've found out that it's maybe not quite what they wanted or it's not what they expected it to be?
Yes, please tell me, because I have one of those right now.
I think if they voiced that and they said, come to you and said, look, you know, this leadership thing is, you know, it's not what I expected. Like, I actually have to do stuff. then I would explain to them that, fair enough. Let's work something out and sort of vacate you from the leadership spot and let it feel a bit more naturally. Like, if they've come and said it to you, then it's just like anything else, really. You just go with it. It'd be pretty easy to solve. If they haven't realised it, and they're either trying to make it something that it isn't, or they're doing it maybe wrong, I guess it depends on the person, whether you speak to them, whether there's someone who could take that criticism, and if they could, maybe you could sort of guide them into the role a little easier. And if they're not someone that can take the criticism, I guess kill their character. I'm not
what
sure.
you can get them. You can make them unsuitable to the role due to unforeseen circumstances. If you agree with the player ahead of time, like in Changeling, you could have their what is it? Not forebearer. What's the one that kidnaps them?
Keeper.
What's it called? The keeper. That's it. You can have their keeper appear or involve in some way in the situation and have a little revenge, or just screw with them a little by, I don't know, chopping off their feet and regrowing them or something. Just making them unsuitable or adding a bit more abuse to where they're too mentally unstable to be the leader anymore.
It would be the DM as well, shining the spotlight, like the stuff we talked about, where either NPCs come in and shine the spotlight on someone else, or the situations shine the spotlight on someone else. And I think if you do that to a point, they'll either sort of develop into it and fall into it naturally a bit more. Maybe if that's too hopeful, rocks fall, I guess. I don't know. It's like, I suppose it's the DM's job anyway to shine the spotlight on everyone. But I think I'd be the type, probably just speak to them, maybe, is the best thing I can think of. If it's that much of an issue, definitely.
When someone who's in a leadership role backs out of that leadership role, a lot of times it's because of a change in character, like the dichotomy going from, oh, I'm a leader, to, holy crap, like this war thing is real. Like there are people dying around me, and kind of changing on a fundamental wiring level. And a GM and the players themselves can engineer that sort of thing, and actually create a really cool new character concept in the process.
No, I think I agree. It's in some ways it's very comforting. It's a good sign to see that someone's thinking that deeply about their character and how sort of events are changing and evolving their character, that they might find themselves in that position where, for an in-character reason, they go, oh, well, I'm maybe not as suited for it as I once was because of how my worldviews have changed or circumstances have changed. So I think an in-character sort of change of heart can lead to a lot of interesting role-play and a lot of sort of conflict and stuff that's very good for the game. I think in terms of someone who maybe for like an out-of-character reason, like maybe their real-life circumstances have changed, like maybe they can't make sessions as often, and they say, oh, well, you really want a party leader who's actually going to be there for more sessions, or for some reason I don't feel as comfortable with it as I thought I would be. I think it can be more difficult then, because you have to almost try and manufacture an in-character justification for that, despite the fact it's been initiated for out-of-character reasons. And obviously not just sort of wanting to go, oh, well, I'm going to engineer some sort of player death to justify that. It can be a little bit more difficult to work that into the narrative. But again, it's like everything. It's much easier if you talk openly to the players and they're willing to sort of buy into that. They obviously know the reason, if it's out of character, that you might be engineering this. But if they're all willing to sort of go along with it in character, it can certainly make things a lot easier for the GM.
Totally.
Okay, guys. So I think that I think we've rambled on about party leaders, or party leader punk, as I'm now going to start referring to it.
Leader punk.
Leader punk, indeed. For a good few hours. So before we start to think about wrapping up the hangout, does anyone have any last questions or comments they want to make on either the place or the role of a party leader, or perhaps Batman's position in the Justice League of America?
There are two types of players. There's the first type of player that goes into the tavern and asks, "Hey GM, is there a bottle for me to grab and break over this guy's head?" And then the GM rolls a die and says, "Yes, there is." And the second type of player is the player that goes in and says, "All right, I enter the tavern, I grab a bottle off the bar, and I smash it over this guy's head," and just creates the world. And that, if you can, encourage your players to do that sort of role playing, because then it will, in my personal experience, it won't matter who emerges as the leader, because that will encourage everybody to build and lead as much as anybody else.
I think you should quote yourself on that one. Get like the text, nice little motivational picture, because that was actually pretty good. 2 types of players.
Okay, Sheppy, do you have any last thoughts on the subject of party leaders?
There, you could actually do a pretty good simulationist way of going about it if you want to, by making the role that the person does out of character, like their particular field, match what the role is in character. And the advantage of that is that there is an inherent understanding of what's going on, so you don't get that where the person doesn't know what it actually means to be a leader in that context. Because when you explain that narratively for the character, then it will mean the same thing for the person. For example, if someone's making decisions in combat, right, because like they're the general or whatever, then you can make that clear just through the communication of appointing a military leader in that campaign that you're going to be making the combat decisions, right? The understanding is implied. So you can use that as a tool to making things more clear ahead of time to prevent issues. If nothing else, delegation and subversion, if that doesn't work. And if not, those are my tactics.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much. And Mike, how about yourself? Any last thoughts or words of wisdom on the topic of leaders in role-playing games?
Probably more that leadership is something that's earned instead of bought. It's something that's sort of given instead of taken. I'm a big fan of leadership developing naturally and organically, and the group coming to a sort of a consensus through play, through action, to that leader. And I think if the GM and the DM or whatever works with the players and the person who is developing as a leader, they can create situations that can enforce that leadership and highlight what type of leader they're being. And I think if they did that with more than one player, naturally you could have a formation of different leaders within a group, or you can have one leader that sort of enables other people in the group to do their thing. And once you start getting that, you start getting it's not just a group, it's like a single entity. It's like a body that's moving its arms and its legs and its heads all in unison, all to achieve something, as opposed to just this amalgamation of gibbering mouths and limbs that just goes all over the place. And I think if you can achieve that in a game, then you have won RPGs, essentially.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. And how about yourself, John? Do you have any final words of wisdom related to the subject of leaders?
I think I think you can be a leader, or you can be leader punk. And I think we all know what we all want and need to be.
You need to be Batman.
That's pretty much all I have to say.
Yeah, be Batman.
Batman is the essence of leader punk.
Yes, be Batman.
He's not the leader you want, he's the leader you deserve.
An army of Batmen. Of Batman. Batman.
I think if I was going to say anything to round off about leadership, I think there's been a lot of good advice and a lot of food for thought in the Hangout. I would say that a lot of the points we've talked about, though, come down to a couple of very key points. The first is communication, whether that be between players and players or players and the GM. As long as the lines of communication are open and everyone's receptive to that sort of two-way communication, a lot of potential problems can be almost ironed out before they've even occurred. And I would say that the second thing when it comes to party leaders is very much that idea of give and take, having your own time in the spotlight, as we've said, but also making sure everyone else is involved and getting into the game and so not just trying to hog it all for yourself. And I think if I had to leave the audience with one final word to sum up everything that we've talked about today, yeah, it'd probably be punk. So
Fight the man.
The final word was punk.
So thank you very much, guys, for joining me today in this hangout. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I've very much enjoyed talking to you all, and I hope the people, and we've still got 5 viewers with us at this stage, although we did reach the dizzying heights of 8, I believe, at one point.
Wow.
So I hope all of you out there are actually watching this either now or in the far unfathomable future will have enjoyed this discussion as much as we enjoyed having it. So take care, guys, and we'll see you all soon.
Fantastic leader.
Thanks.
And don't forget, punk.